The night air above the Nile River felt warm even after the sun had gone away. A soft wind moved slowly through the tall reeds near the dark water. Somewhere far across the riverbank, a dog barked once and then became quiet again. Mud brick homes rested beneath the stars, their flat roofs still holding the heat of the long day. Most people were already asleep. Workers who had spent hours carrying stone or cutting grain now rested on woven mats beside sleeping children and small oil lamps that burned low into the night. Ancient Egypt became very quiet after dark. The busy sounds of markets faded away. The donkeys stopped braying. Sandals no longer scraped across crowded streets. The riverboats tied beside wooden docks rocked gently against the water while fishermen slept beneath thin linen cloths. And in the silence of those late hours, another day slowly waited to begin. Long before sunrise, before birds crossed the pale sky, many Egyptian homes would already begin preparing food for the coming heat of the day. Cooking was never simple in the ancient world. Even something as ordinary as a warm piece of bread or a bowl of lentils required patience, labor, and careful planning. People today often imagine ancient kitchens filled with metal pots, glowing ovens, and strong cooking fires controlled with iron tools. But the people of Egypt lived very differently. Many homes had no proper fireplaces at all. There were no modern stoves, no matches, no metal burners, no comfortable kitchens protected from smoke and heat. And for many ordinary families, even basic fire tools were difficult to own. The ancient Egyptians cooked with clay, stone, straw, ash, sunlight, patience, and experience passed quietly from one generation to another. In small villages beside the Nile, women woke while the stars still covered the sky. The air at that hour felt softer than it would later in the day. By midday, the heat would press heavily against the earth, filling homes with dry warmth that clung to skin and clothing. But before dawn, there was still a little coolness left. A woman might rise silently from a woven mat beside her family. Her feet touched the dusty floor carefully so she would not wake the children sleeping nearby. The room smelled faintly of old smoke, dry grain, and river mud carried in from sandals. Outside, the village remained dark blue beneath the fading night. She would step into a small courtyard where cooking often happened. Most Egyptian homes did not have separate kitchens as people imagine today. Cooking areas were usually simple open spaces beside the house or on flat rooftops where smoke could escape into the sky. There, near a wall made from sun-dried mud bricks, sat a clay oven blackened from years of use. It was simple, round, heavy, cracked from heat, and beside it rested the remains of yesterday's fire. Ash, charcoal, burned straw, tiny pieces of wood. Nothing was wasted in ancient Egypt. Fuel itself was precious. Along the Nile River, large forests were rare. Wood had value. Good dry wood was often saved carefully or traded at markets. Poorer families sometimes cooked with dried reeds, straw, animal dung, palm branches, or scraps gathered slowly over many days. Even making fire itself could feel like work. Without modern tools, Egyptian families protected their cooking flames carefully. If a household allowed its fire to die completely, starting another could become difficult and time-consuming. Many families tried to keep embers alive overnight beneath layers of ash. So in the quiet darkness before dawn, one of the first tasks each morning was checking the old fire. The woman might kneel beside the oven and gently brush aside the pale ash using a broken pottery shard or smooth stick. If she was lucky, a faint red glow still waited underneath. Tiny living heat. Enough to begin again. She would blow softly onto the ember. Slow breaths. Patient breaths. The red glow brightened. Then came dried grass, tiny reeds, bits of straw, carefully placed. More breathing. A little smoke rose upward into the cool morning air, thin and gray. The smell drifted across the sleeping courtyard. Soon the first weak flame appeared, small but alive. This simple moment repeated itself across Egypt for thousands of years. Before temples opened, before markets filled, before scribes unrolled papyrus beside government buildings, fire returned quietly to the ancient world. As the sky slowly lightened above the Nile, more homes awakened. Roosters cried from somewhere beyond the village walls. Donkeys shifted in narrow streets. Water carriers began walking toward the river with clay jars balanced against their shoulders. And cooking began. Bread stood at the center of Egyptian life. Not rich food served in palaces. Not great feasts. Bread. Simple coarse bread made from emmer wheat or barley fed workers, farmers, fishermen, servants, and children every single day. Some families ate bread with onions. Others with lentils, dates, or dried fish. Wealthier homes added honey, figs, or herbs. But bread remained constant. Making it required many hours of labor. The grain first had to be crushed into flour using heavy grinding stones. This work often belonged to women or servants, and it was exhausting. They knelt for long periods pushing stone against stone in a steady rhythm while fine dust covered their hands and arms. The sound filled villages every morning. Stone scraping grain. Slow. Repetitive. Endless. The flour itself was rough compared to modern bread flour. Tiny grains of sand sometimes mixed into it from the grinding stones. Many Egyptian skeletons discovered thousands of years later showed worn teeth from years of chewing coarse bread filled with small mineral particles. Still, bread brought comfort. Fresh bread meant the household had survived another day. Once flour was ready, it mixed with water into dough. Sometimes yeast from older dough batches helped it rise slightly. Sometimes it remained flat and dense. The dough was shaped by hand while children waited nearby, still sleepy from the night. Cooking the bread without proper fire tools required creativity. Some homes used clay ovens shaped like wide jars standing upright. Others baked bread directly against heated stone surfaces. Poorer families sometimes buried dough beneath hot ash or placed it over flat stones heated by open flames. The heat came unevenly. Smoke blew into eyes. Ash covered skin. The work was hot even in early morning. An Egyptian woman might squat beside the clay oven while sweat slowly formed across her forehead. She used long sticks, broken pottery pieces, or rough cloth to move hot food because metal tools remained uncommon and expensive for ordinary people. Hands learned distance, timing, heat. People understood fire through experience rather than instruments. Children grew up watching these movements every day. They learned how close fingers could safely move near hot clay. They learned the smell of bread almost ready to turn black. They learned how different fuel burned. Palm leaves burned quickly. Dung burned slower. Dry reeds made fast bright flames. The knowledge lived inside memory. No written instructions were needed. As sunlight spread across the village, smoke rose from many rooftops into the pale golden sky. The smell of baking grain drifted through narrow streets where workers now prepared for long days in the fields or on building sites. Ancient Egypt depended heavily on labor. Workers carried limestone blocks beneath burning sun. Farmers bent over muddy fields beside the Nile. Fishermen pulled heavy nets from river water while insects buzzed through thick reeds. Food gave them strength. Even poor meals mattered deeply. In wealthier homes, servants prepared larger amounts of food using bigger clay ovens and wider courtyards. But even these kitchens remained difficult places. Fire meant smoke. Heat meant exhaustion. During summer months, cooking fires turned enclosed spaces into ovens themselves. Servants worked slowly through sweat and heavy air. Some kitchens contained small charcoal braziers made from clay or metal. These portable heat sources allowed cooking without large open fires. A shallow container held burning charcoal beneath pots balanced carefully above the heat. But charcoal itself required effort to make and preserve. Nothing came easily. In busy cities like ancient Thebes or Memphis, food sellers prepared meals outdoors beneath woven shade coverings. Travelers walking dusty roads could smell onions frying in oil or fish drying beneath the sun. Cooking smells mixed with river smells. Mud. Smoke. Warm grain. Animal sweat. Wet reeds. Human life crowded close together along the Nile. At midday, the heat became difficult. Workers searched for shade whenever possible. Builders rested beside unfinished stone walls while sweat dried white against their skin. Farmers wrapped cloth around their heads and moved slower beneath the crushing sunlight. Inside homes, cooking often paused during the hottest hours. The fires already burning since dawn had heated the clay ovens and surrounding walls. The air shimmered softly above rooftops. Dogs slept beneath carts. Even birds seemed quieter. Some families prepared cold foods during this time instead. Dates. Figs. Cheese. Beer. Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, and filling. It provided important nutrition for many workers and was safer to drink than dirty water in some crowded places. Children drank weaker forms. Laborers received beer as payment. Builders working on royal tombs sometimes received bread and beer every day as wages. The beer itself came from grain. Again, bread remained connected to nearly everything. Near the Nile River, fishermen cleaned their catches beneath the shade of palm trees. Fish spoiled quickly in the Egyptian heat, so many were salted or dried to preserve them longer. Cooking fresh fish without proper tools required careful handling. Clay pots became essential. Egyptian pottery appeared everywhere in daily life. Simple bowls. Water jars. Beer containers. Cooking pots blackened by years of smoke. Many meals slowly cooked inside these clay vessels placed near open coals rather than directly inside flames. Lentils simmered gently with herbs. Onions softened slowly. Stews thickened over patient heat while cooks adjusted burning fuel by hand. The process demanded attention. Too much flame cracked pottery. Too little heat spoiled food. People learned balance through long experience. In smaller homes, entire families often shared one room during the night. Cooking smoke darkened ceilings and walls over many years. Soot gathered in corners. The smell of ash stayed trapped inside woven fabric and sleeping mats. And yet these homes still held warmth. Not wealth. Not comfort in the modern sense. But closeness. At night, after long days of labor, families gathered around simple meals while oil lamps flickered softly against mud walls. Children listened to older relatives speak quietly about river levels, taxes, temple festivals, or changing weather. Outside, the desert wind moved through narrow streets. Inside, the fire slowly faded again. An old grandmother might tear bread carefully with rough hands worn from decades of grinding grain and carrying water. Her knees hurt from years spent kneeling beside ovens. Smoke had touched her lungs for most of her life. Still, she knew exactly how to keep embers alive until morning. This knowledge mattered. Without steady cooking fires, survival became harder. During flood seasons, when Nile waters rose across farmland, villages sometimes struggled to keep dry fuel. Damp reeds smoked heavily and burned poorly. Families protected precious fuel supplies beneath roofs or inside storage jars whenever possible. Life beside the Nile brought both abundance and difficulty. The river gave water, fish, fertile soil, and transportation. But the river also brought insects, mud, humidity, sickness, and endless labor. Cooking reflected all of it. In farming villages far from royal temples, evening meals often remained very simple. A pot of lentils cooked slowly through the afternoon might feed an entire household. Bread baked earlier in the day became hard by nightfall but still filled empty stomachs. Workers returned home exhausted. Their bodies carried dust from roads and fields. Their shoulders ached. Their feet felt raw inside simple sandals. Some men washed quietly beside water jars before eating. Others simply sat in silence while children leaned sleepily against their arms. The cooking fire gave light as much as heat. Without it, darkness arrived quickly. Ancient nights were truly dark once lamps burned low. The stars above Egypt appeared bright beyond imagination. Entire rivers of light stretched across the sky while desert winds carried distant sounds over long distances. Sometimes travelers arrived late. A merchant moving slowly along the Nile might stop beside a village after sunset searching for food and rest. Small roadside cooking places served warm bread, beer, onions, and perhaps fish if supplies remained. The travelers sat quietly beneath oil lamps while insects circled the light. Someone always watched the fire. Even during sleep, embers had value. A household without fire might need to borrow coals from neighbors at dawn. This happened often. One woman carrying a clay bowl might walk quietly across a narrow lane to another home where smoke already rose into the morning sky. No shame existed in this. Communities depended on one another. Fire passed from house to house just like stories, grain, or water. And so the ancient Egyptian world awakened again each day through these small ordinary acts. Not through kings. Not through pyramids. But through smoke rising softly before sunrise. In larger estates owned by wealthy officials, kitchens became busier and more organized. Servants moved constantly through courtyards carrying baskets of grain, vegetables, herbs, and jars of oil. Bakers worked near ovens for hours while cooks prepared meals for dozens of people. Still, even wealthy kitchens lacked many tools people expect today. Most cooking remained deeply physical. Hands touched everything. Grinding. Mixing. Carrying. Lifting. Turning. Sweat ran constantly during hot months. The air inside crowded kitchens felt thick from smoke and steam. Young servants learned quickly to avoid burns from hot clay surfaces and splattering oil. Accidents happened often. Broken pottery cut bare feet. Fires flared unexpectedly when dry reeds caught too quickly. Smoke irritated eyes until tears formed naturally. But life continued in steady rhythm. Morning fires. Midday heat. Evening meals. Night silence. Then morning again. Near temple complexes, enormous kitchens prepared food offerings for priests and rituals. Bread ovens there worked almost continuously. Animals were butchered nearby while workers carried jars of beer through shaded stone corridors. Religion itself connected closely to food preparation. Offerings fed both the living and the dead. Egyptians believed the dead continued needing nourishment in the afterlife. Tomb paintings often showed servants baking bread, brewing beer, carrying meat, and preparing endless meals for the spirits of the deceased. Even eternity required cooking. And somewhere in those painted scenes, tiny fires still burned beneath clay ovens. Far from royal tombs, ordinary villagers probably never imagined their daily routines would survive thousands of years inside archaeological discoveries. Yet fragments remained. Broken bread molds. Blackened hearthstones. Ash layers. Grinding tools worn smooth by countless hands. These quiet objects tell stories not of glory, but of repetition. Of tired people feeding families. Of smoke drifting into pale dawn skies. Of women kneeling beside ovens while children still slept nearby. One can almost hear the soft sounds of those mornings. Grain pouring into stone grinders. Crackling straw. Breathing against weak embers. River water moving slowly beyond the reeds. The world of ancient Egypt was never silent, but it often moved gently. Especially before sunrise. In some desert communities beyond the fertile Nile Valley, fuel became even harder to find. People adapted carefully to harsh conditions. Dried animal dung served as important cooking fuel because it burned slowly and remained easier to collect than wood. Children sometimes gathered it during the day, carrying baskets beneath the hot sun. The fuel dried for many days before use. The smell lingered faintly during cooking fires, mixing with bread and dust. Nothing in ancient life separated cleanly from labor. Every meal required effort stretching far beyond the cooking itself. Water had to be carried. Fuel gathered. Grain harvested. Flour ground. Clay pots repaired. Fires protected. Even a poor bowl of soup represented hours of human work. And yet people still found moments of peace. After sunset, rooftops cooled slowly beneath the stars. Families sat together where faint breezes moved through the warm darkness. Someone might share dried figs while speaking softly about the coming harvest. An older man rubbed sore muscles beside a dying cooking fire. Children fell asleep listening to insects outside the walls. The smell of smoke stayed in the night air long after flames disappeared. And beneath soft layers of ash, tiny red embers waited patiently for another dawn. Before the first light touched the eastern horizon, the Nile already moved quietly through the darkness. The river never truly rested. Its water slipped past reeds and muddy banks with slow steady movement, carrying fishing boats, floating leaves, and the reflection of fading stars. In the deep quiet before dawn, the air felt cooler beside the water. Fishermen waking on small boats wrapped rough linen cloth around their shoulders and listened to frogs calling softly from the marshes. Farther inland, behind rows of mud brick homes, cooking fires slowly returned to life once again. A faint thread of smoke rose into the pale night sky. Then another. Then many more. Across villages and crowded towns, Egyptian households began the same careful work they had done the day before and the day before that, stretching backward through countless generations. The work changed little over time. Fire still needed protection. Fuel still needed gathering. Bread still needed baking before the heavy heat arrived. And people still woke tired. An old laborer might rise slowly from a woven sleeping mat with stiff knees and aching shoulders from hauling stone the previous day. His hands remained rough from rope and dust. Beside him, his wife already prepared the morning fire while the youngest child slept quietly against the wall. The home remained dim except for the soft orange glow coming from the courtyard. Most ordinary Egyptian homes were small. Many contained only a few rooms with low ceilings designed to trap less heat during the day. Walls made from dried Nile mud helped keep interiors cooler, though smoke from years of cooking often stained them dark above the hearth areas. In wealthier homes, servants handled much of the food preparation. But among ordinary families, everyone shared some part of the labor. Even children worked. Young girls learned to grind grain almost as soon as they were strong enough to push stone against stone. Boys gathered reeds, fetched water, carried baskets, or helped maintain ovens. Life in ancient Egypt rarely allowed long periods of idleness for poor families. The Nile gave life, but surviving beside it demanded constant effort. As dawn slowly approached, the village began filling with familiar sounds. Grinding stones. Quiet voices. Goats shifting in pens. Clay jars touching against one another. Sandals brushing dusty ground. And beneath it all came the soft crackle of growing fires. Without metal stoves or proper cooking grates, many Egyptian cooks relied entirely on memory and touch. They understood heat by observing smoke color, by feeling warmth against skin, by listening to bubbling clay pots, or by watching the way bread browned against hot surfaces. A woman baking flat bread might press dough carefully onto the inner wall of a clay oven heated by burning reeds and straw. She moved quickly, knowing the heat could burn exposed skin within moments. The oven itself radiated warmth into the cool dawn air, already promising the brutal heat still waiting later in the day. The bread cooked fast. Sometimes too fast. Some loaves burned black around the edges while remaining soft in the middle. Others hardened like stone if left too long inside the oven. Egyptian bread varied greatly depending on skill, fuel, and available grain. No two mornings were exactly alike. Outside one home, an elderly woman sat beside a low charcoal brazier stirring lentils inside a blackened clay pot. Her movements appeared slow but practiced. Steam drifted upward carrying the smell of onion and herbs into the narrow lane nearby. Her granddaughter watched carefully from beside the doorway. The child's eyes still looked heavy with sleep, but she observed everything. How much water to add? When to stir? How close the pot should rest near the coals? The knowledge passed silently through observation long before spoken instruction became necessary. Cooking in ancient Egypt relied deeply on watching and remembering. There were no written recipes hanging on walls. No measurements carefully recorded. Experience shaped everything. Near larger cities, bakeries sometimes filled entire streets with warm smells before sunrise. Workers inside these crowded spaces labored through smoke and sweat while shaping dough in enormous quantities. Clay bread molds lined shelves beside the ovens. Some loaves were round. Some cone-shaped. Some flat and rough. The bakers themselves worked through exhausting conditions. Their bodies glistened with sweat long before morning sunlight fully appeared. The ovens radiated unbearable heat during summer months. Ash covered arms and feet. Smoke stung eyes until tears mixed with dust on their faces. Yet the work never stopped for long. Cities demanded food every day. In places like ancient Memphis, laborers building monuments or unloading boats required large supplies of bread and beer simply to continue working. Feeding the population became one of the great quiet labors of Egyptian civilization. Not glorious labor. Not celebrated labor. But necessary. A scribe sitting comfortably beneath temple shade might record grain deliveries onto papyrus while nearby workers carried baskets of fuel through the heat. Behind every loaf of bread stood many invisible tasks. Someone harvested grain beneath the burning sun. Someone crushed it into flour. Someone gathered reeds for fire. Someone shaped clay ovens from river mud. Someone carried water from the Nile before dawn. And someone knelt beside the heat each morning while smoke drifted into tired eyes. The desert itself shaped Egyptian cooking in countless ways. Dry air preserved foods differently than wetter lands. Fish hung from wooden frames to dry beneath the sun. Dates remained edible for long periods. Grains stored carefully inside sealed jars survived months if protected from insects and dampness. but the heat also spoiled food quickly. Milk soured. Fresh meat rotted. Cooked meals turned bad if left too long in the open air. Because of this, many Egyptian households prepared smaller meals more frequently rather than storing large amounts of cooked food. Fires often returned several times throughout the day despite the discomfort. In farming villages during harvest seasons, activity began especially early. Workers needed food before entering the fields. As sunlight slowly painted the Nile Valley gold, groups of farmers gathered beside irrigation canals carrying simple meals wrapped in cloth or stored in baskets. Bread remained the center of nearly every meal. Some carried onions tucked beneath their arms. Others carried dried fish or jars of beer thick enough to resemble soup. The mornings still felt bearable then. Birds crossed the pale sky above the river. Water buffalo moved heavily through muddy ground. The smell of wet earth mixed with cooking smoke drifting from nearby homes. Women remained behind in the villages, continuing household labor long after the men disappeared into the fields. There was always more work waiting. Grinding grain again. Cleaning clay pots. Fetching water. Repairing damaged baskets. Preparing vegetables. Watching children. Maintaining fires. The labor of food preparation stretched endlessly through Egyptian life. Even wealthier homes depended upon servants working from dawn until late evening inside hot kitchens. Young servant girls carried heavy jars across stone courtyards while cooks shouted instructions through thick smoke. Bread ovens consumed huge amounts of fuel each day, and someone always needed to gather more. Palm branches arrived tied in bundles. Dry reeds stacked beside walls. Animal dung dried carefully beneath the sun. Nothing useful could be wasted. During seasons when Nile floods covered surrounding farmland, finding dry fuel became harder. Damp reeds produced heavy smoke that clung low in the air. Cooking fires burned weakly. Meals took longer to prepare. People adapted constantly. Adaptation formed the center of ancient survival. A cook unable to maintain strong flames might bury pots partly in hot ash to preserve heat longer. Bread dough could be flattened thinner so it cooked faster over weaker fires. Stone surfaces heated during daylight sometimes continued warming food after sunset. People learned patience because they had little choice. At midday, much of Egypt slowed beneath the crushing heat. The sunlight reflected harshly from pale stone walls and dusty roads. Air shimmered above rooftops. Workers in the fields searched desperately for shade beside canals or beneath date palms. Even animals rested quietly where shadows gathered. Inside homes, cooking became difficult. Fires added unbearable warmth to already overheated rooms. Many families avoided heavy cooking during these hours if possible. Some meals were prepared early and eaten later at room temperature. Others relied on dried foods requiring little heating. Still, life did not stop entirely. A mother might sit in the shade peeling onions while a baby slept nearby. An old man repaired fishing nets beside a dying charcoal fire. Two young sisters carried water jars together through narrow streets lined with sleeping dogs and drifting dust. The smell of warm bread still lingered faintly in the air from the morning baking. Along the riverbanks, fishermen sometimes cooked their catch immediately after returning from the water. Without metal pans or modern cooking surfaces, they often roasted fish directly above coals or wrapped them in leaves near heated stones. The fish cooked quickly in the desert heat. Flies gathered constantly. Smoke drifted low across the reeds. Nearby children waited impatiently for scraps while older fishermen repaired damaged nets with slow, tired movements. These men lived hard lives. The Nile provided food, but fishing demanded endless labor beneath sun and insects. Hands hardened from rope and water. Skin darkened from exposure. Many fishermen slept lightly because work often began before dawn or continued late into the night when river conditions changed. Food preparation never separated itself from exhaustion. Everywhere across Egypt, tired bodies moved beside cooking fires. Builders hauling limestone for temples paused briefly to eat coarse bread in the shade of unfinished walls. Scribes working inside administrative buildings dipped bread into lentil stew during quiet midday breaks. Servants carried trays of figs and beer through wealthy homes while sweat formed beneath linen clothing. Even priests inside temple complexes depended on kitchens filled with ordinary workers. Temple kitchens were enormous compared to village homes. Fires burned almost constantly there. Huge quantities of bread baked daily for rituals, offerings, and temple staff. Workers moved through clouds of flour dust while carrying baskets heavier than small children. The heat inside these spaces became overwhelming. Smoke-stained ceilings black. Ash-coated floors. Clay ovens radiated fierce warmth deep into the evening. And yet the rhythm continued steadily, day after day, year after year. Near sunset, the atmosphere of Egyptian life began changing again. The worst heat slowly loosened its grip on the land. Shadows stretched longer across roads and courtyards. Farmers returned from the fields covered in dust and sweat. Donkeys carrying baskets shuffled slowly toward village storage areas. And cooking fires awakened once more. Evening meals brought brief moments of calm after long labor. In one small riverside village, a family gathered on a flat rooftop where faint breezes moved through the darkness. The mother tore pieces of warm bread while the father rubbed aching muscles beside a clay lamp flickering softly in the night air. Their children leaned sleepily against each other. Far below, somewhere beyond the walls, another cooking fire crackled quietly. The smell of onions cooking in oil drifted through the warm darkness. Night in ancient Egypt often felt gentler than day. The stars emerged brilliantly above the desert sky. Without modern light, the heavens appeared endless and alive. River water reflected silver moonlight while insects hummed softly through the reeds. Cooking during these hours became slower. More peaceful. Less rushed by heat. A woman preparing stew over low coals might stir silently while listening to distant voices carry through the night air. Nearby neighbors sat together outside their homes speaking quietly about crops, taxes, illnesses, or rumors from larger cities upriver. Children gradually disappeared indoors to sleep. The fires burned lower. The village softened into silence. But some workers remained awake much later. Bakers often prepared dough during cooler nighttime hours before the next morning rush. River traders arriving after sunset searched for warm food before sleeping beside their cargo boats. Guards stationed near temples or granaries warmed simple meals over tiny charcoal braziers while watching dark empty streets. Ancient Egypt never completely slept. Somewhere, always, a small fire remained alive. And keeping those fires alive required careful attention. Without matches or easy tools, many families feared losing their household flame entirely. Before sleeping, cooks often buried glowing embers beneath thick ash layers to preserve heat until morning. Ash insulated the coals, allowing tiny hidden sparks to survive through the night. This small act carried enormous importance. An ember meant tomorrow's bread, tomorrow's stew, tomorrow's warmth. A woman might kneel quietly before bed, checking the fire one last time while her family already slept nearby. She added another thin layer of ash carefully by hand. The glow disappeared beneath pale gray dust. But underneath, life remained. The courtyard darkened completely except for moonlight touching the mud brick walls. Beyond the village, desert wind crossed empty land where caravans moved slowly beneath the stars. Travelers wrapped cloth around their faces against drifting sand while distant jackals cried into the night. Back near the Nile, the river continued flowing patiently through the darkness just as it always had. And inside countless Egyptian homes, tiny sleeping embers waited silently beneath the ash. The embers beneath the ash still held warmth when the next morning arrived. In the deep blue hour before sunrise, when the Nile looked almost black beneath the fading stars, the first people began waking once again. The air felt heavy but gentle. A faint coolness drifted across the riverbanks before the coming heat settled over the land. Inside small mud brick homes, families stirred slowly from sleep. A child rolled quietly beneath a linen cloth. An old man coughed softly in the darkness. Somewhere nearby, a goat shifted against a wooden fence. And in courtyards across Egypt, hands reached once more toward yesterday's buried fire. Cooking shaped nearly every hour of ordinary life. Not grand cooking. Not meals prepared for kings or nobles. But the quiet labor of feeding tired workers, hungry children, and aging parents beneath the endless rhythm of the Egyptian sun. A woman stepped barefoot into her courtyard carrying a shallow clay bowl. The earth beneath her feet still felt cool from the night. She knelt beside the oven, brushed away pale ash carefully, and searched for hidden heat beneath the gray surface. A faint red glow answered her. She breathed gently onto it. The ember brightened. Tiny sparks appeared inside the darkness like sleeping stars waking slowly. Soon thin reeds crackled softly above the ember while smoke curled upward into the quiet dawn air. The smell drifted across nearby rooftops where other fires already flickered awake. This moment repeated itself across villages, cities, riverbanks, and farming settlements throughout Egypt. Morning always began with fire. Without strong metal tools, Egyptian cooks relied heavily on clay. Clay shaped their ovens, their storage jars, their cooking pots, their plates, and even many of their bread molds. The Nile River itself provided much of this material. Mud gathered from riverbanks dried beneath the sun until it hardened into useful forms. The entire civilization seemed built from river mud and patience. Potters worked long hours shaping cooking vessels by hand. Their workshops smelled of wet earth, smoke, and dust. Rows of unfinished bowls and pots rested outside drying beneath sunlight while nearby kilns burned slowly through the day. Many cooking pots remained simple and rough. Some cracked easily from sudden heat. Others lasted many years, blackened by smoke and stained by stews cooked hundreds of times. When a pot finally broke, pieces were rarely thrown far away. Broken pottery still had value. Sharp fragments scraped ashes from ovens, covered food, supported fires, or lined pathways through muddy areas. Nothing disappeared completely in ancient Egypt. Everything found another use. As dawn brightened, grain grinders already worked steadily inside many homes. The sound echoed softly through village streets. Stone against stone. Slow. Heavy. Repetitive. Women bent over grinding stones while flour dust gathered on their arms and faces. The labor strained backs and shoulders. Knees hardened from years spent kneeling against rough floors. Yet this work could not be avoided. Without flour there was no bread. And without bread, most Egyptian households faced hunger very quickly. Bread itself varied depending on wealth and circumstance. Richer families sometimes flavored dough with honey, dates, herbs, or oils. Poorer families often ate darker coarse loaves made from barley or rough emmer flour mixed with bits of grit from grinding stones. Still, even plain bread brought comfort. Warm bread especially. There was something deeply human about the smell of baking grain rising into cool morning air while the rest of the world still half slept. In narrow village lanes, Children followed these smells before fully waking. They rubbed tired eyes while watching mothers flatten dough with practiced hands. Some children waited impatiently near ovens hoping for pieces of fresh bread too small to save. The ovens themselves demanded careful attention. Most ordinary Egyptian ovens were rounded clay structures open at the top or side. Heat gathered inside thick walls while flames consumed reeds, straw, dung, or scraps of wood placed beneath or within the chamber. Managing heat without proper tools required skill learned slowly over many years. A baker might judge oven temperature simply by placing a hand near the clay surface for a brief moment. Too cool and the dough stayed pale and heavy. Too hot and the bread burned before cooking through. Every morning brought small adjustments. More fuel. Less ash. Different placement. Different timing. No exact measurements existed. Only memory and instinct. As the sun rose higher, the village fully awakened. Men prepared for field labor beside irrigation canals. Builders gathered ropes and stone tools. Scribes carrying papyrus rolls walked toward temple compounds or government buildings where long hours of writing waited. Many carried simple meals wrapped in cloth. Bread remained the center. Always bread. Alongside it came onions, beans, lentils, dates, or dried fish depending on what a family could afford. Food reflected survival more than pleasure for most people. The heat shaped everything. By mid-morning, sunlight already pressed heavily against mud walls and dusty roads. Workers wiped sweat constantly from their necks. Sandals scraped slowly across hot ground while insects drifted lazily above irrigation water. Cooking fires made the air even heavier. In wealthier households, servants often prepared food in open courtyards where smoke escaped more easily. Large homes sometimes contained separate areas for grinding grain, baking bread, storing jars, and preparing meat. But even these kitchens remained exhausting places. Servants moved quickly through thick heat carrying heavy clay pots balanced carefully against their hips. Charcoal braziers glowed beside walls blackened by years of smoke. Oil splattered. Steam rose. Sweat-soaked linen clothing. And still the work continued. One young servant girl carried water jars from the Nile several times each day because cooking required constant water. Another sorted onions beneath a woven shade covering while flies gathered nearby. An older cook stirred stew slowly with a wooden stick beside glowing coals. Their world smelled of smoke and grain. Of warm oil. Of river mud drying beneath the sun. In poorer neighborhoods of larger cities, food sellers worked beside crowded roads where merchants, laborers, and travelers passed throughout the day. Some sold bread directly from clay ovens built against alley walls. Others cooked fish or vegetables over portable braziers filled with charcoal. The streets felt alive but tired. Donkeys pushed through crowds carrying baskets of reeds or grain sacks. Workers shouted softly to one another while dust floated through sunlight. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried from an open doorway while an old woman swept ash from her courtyard. Cooking sounds blended into the life of the city. The crackle of straw fires. Clay lids knocking against pots. Grinding stones turning. Oil bubbling quietly. Nothing moved quickly. Even busy places carried a certain heaviness beneath the heat. Near the Nile docks, fishermen unloaded fresh catches onto wooden tables damp from river water. Fish scales glimmered briefly in the sunlight before disappearing beneath knives and salt. Fish spoiled quickly beneath Egyptian heat, so many were cleaned immediately after catching. Some roasted over open coals. Others dried beneath the sun for storage. Salt became precious because it preserved food longer during hot seasons. The fishermen themselves often looked exhausted before noon. They worked through insects, muddy water, tangled nets, and blazing sunlight reflected from the river surface. Their hands cracked from wet rope and salt. Their backs ached from lifting heavy catches. Yet after returning to shore, many still needed to prepare food for their families. Labor rarely ended completely. Near farming villages, midday meals were often eaten in whatever shade workers could find. A group of men might sit silently beside a canal wall chewing coarse bread while wiping sweat from their faces. Nearby, water buffaloes stood knee-deep in muddy water trying to escape flies and heat. The food itself remained simple. But after hours beneath the sun, even simple food mattered deeply. Bread dipped in oil. A few onions. Lentils cooked before dawn. Beer carried in clay jars wrapped with damp cloth to keep them cooler. The beer was thick and cloudy, almost like liquid grain. It nourished workers and eased thirst during long days. Children drank weaker versions. Entire households depended on it. And always, behind every jar of beer stood another long chain of labor. Grain harvested. Grain soaked. Grain fermented. Clay jars cleaned and sealed. Nothing arrived easily. By afternoon, the heat often became overwhelming. Many villages grew quieter during these hours. Dogs slept beneath carts. Market activity slowed. Even birds disappeared into whatever shade they could find. Inside homes, some women continued preparing evening meals before darkness arrived. Others repaired damaged baskets or patched linen clothing beside low cooking fires. Smoke drifted lazily upward through still air. An elderly grandmother might sit near the doorway shaping dough slowly with worn hands. Her fingers moved carefully from decades of repetition. She had likely spent most of her life beside ovens and fires. Her lungs carried years of smoke. Her knees hurt from grinding grain. Yet she still remembered exactly how her own mother once cooked. And her grandmother before that. Knowledge survived through repetition more than written instruction. Children learned simply by remaining nearby. A little girl watching bread bake day after day eventually understood timing without explanation. A young boy gathering reeds for fuel learned which plants burned quickly and which lasted longer. The lessons entered quietly through ordinary life. Toward evening, the land slowly softened again. The sunlight turned deeper and more golden across the Nile Valley. Long shadows stretched beside temple walls and palm trees. Workers began returning home covered in dust and sweat from the day. And once more, cooking fires brightened across Egypt. Evening meals often felt calmer than morning work. The urgency of preparing workers for the fields had passed. Families gathered together more slowly now. Children played in narrow streets while mothers stirred stews over low coals. The smell of onions cooking drifted gently through the warm evening air. A father returning from canal work washed his hands beside a clay jar before sitting quietly on the rooftop beside his family. His muscles ached from lifting mud and stone all day. Dust clung to his skin. Nearby, his wife tore fresh bread into pieces while a small oil lamp flickered against the darkening sky. The children leaned close together listening to distant village sounds. Someone singing softly. A donkey shifting in its sleep. The crackling of nearby fires. Night carried relief. Not coolness exactly, but relief from direct sunlight. People lingered outside longer after dark. Rooftops became places of rest where faint breezes moved gently through the warm air. Families spoke quietly while watching stars appear above the desert horizon. The stars over ancient Egypt looked endless. Without modern lights, the sky filled completely with shining points reflected faintly in the Nile below. River water moved slowly through silver moonlight while insects hummed softly among reeds. Cooking fires glowed like tiny orange islands across the darkness. In wealthier homes, late evening meals sometimes included roasted duck, figs, sweet cakes, or wine. Musicians might play softly during gatherings while servants moved carefully through lamp-lit courtyards carrying trays of food. But for most people, supper remained modest. Bread, beans, lentils, maybe fish if the river had been generous. Yet even modest meals carried comfort at night. Especially after hard labor. Near temple kitchens, workers still moved long after ordinary homes quieted. Religious rituals required constant food preparation for offerings and priests. Bread ovens burned late into the night while laborers cleaned cooking vessels beside torchlight. The smell there remained thick with ash and hot grain. One young kitchen worker might scrub clay pots silently while fighting sleep. Another carried fuel baskets beneath moonlight through stone corridors still warm from the day's heat. Their work would begin again before dawn. Everything repeated endlessly. Fire, bread, water, smoke, ash. The rhythm of Egyptian life turned slowly like the river itself. Near midnight, many village fires finally burned low. Families slept together inside warm dark homes while embers glowed softly beneath clay ovens. Outside, the desert wind moved gently across empty roads where travelers rested beside tethered donkeys. Somewhere along the Nile, a fisherman remained awake checking his nets beneath the stars. Elsewhere, a baker quietly prepared tomorrow's dough beneath flickering oil light. And hidden beneath layers of pale ash, tiny embers waited patiently once again for morning. The Nile carried cool mist across the reeds just before sunrise. For a little while each morning, before the desert heat spread over the valley, Egypt felt softer. The river moved quietly beneath fading stars while distant birds crossed the pale horizon in dark silent shapes. Along muddy banks, fishing boats rocked gently against wooden posts. Palm leaves rustled faintly in the warm breeze. And from hundreds of homes beside the river, smoke slowly began rising once more. At first the smoke appeared thin and gray against the dim sky. Then thicker. Then everywhere. Another day of cooking had begun. Inside one small riverside house, a mother sat beside yesterday's oven while her youngest son still slept nearby with one arm over his face. The room smelled faintly of old ash, dry reeds, warm dust, and smoke trapped in the walls from many years of fires. The woman brushed away ash carefully using a broken piece of pottery. Tiny glowing embers still survived beneath. She smiled slightly at the sight. Keeping a fire alive through the night always felt important. It saved time. It saved effort. More than that, it gave a household a sense of steadiness in a world where so much labor could suddenly become difficult. Floods came. Fuel disappeared. Illness spread. Grain failed. But if fire remained alive in the morning, the day could still begin properly. She placed thin reeds over the ember and leaned close, breathing softly. Smoke curled upward into her face. Her eyes watered slightly, though she hardly noticed any more. Most Egyptian cooks lived beside smoke nearly every day of their lives. The reeds crackled. A small flame appeared. Soon the oven breathed warmth again. Outside, the village slowly awakened around her. An old donkey brayed somewhere beyond the walls. Sandals scraped dusty ground. Clay jars knocked gently together as water carriers walked toward the Nile before the roads became crowded and hot. Near another house, two sisters already worked beside a grinding stone. The older girl pushed the upper stone forward with steady tired arms while grain crushed slowly beneath its weight. The younger child gathered flour carefully into a shallow bowl, though much of it scattered onto the floor. They had done this almost every morning for years. Grinding grain remained one of the longest and most exhausting parts of Egyptian cooking. The work strained wrists, shoulders, backs, and knees. Fine grain dust filled the air and settled into skin, hair, and clothing. But without flour, there would be no bread for the family. No meal for the father working in the fields. No food for younger children. No beer brewing for later days. Everything depended on grain. As dawn brightened, more villagers stepped into narrow streets carrying baskets, fuel bundles, or fishing nets. The sky slowly turned pale gold above the Nile while smoke drifted low over rooftops. The village smelled alive now. Warm bread. Ash. Mud. River water. Animal dung drying beside walls. Onions cooking in oil. The smells mixed together so naturally that most people no longer noticed them separately. For Egyptian cooks, fuel always remained precious. Wood was valuable and often difficult to gather in large amounts. Along the Nile Valley, people depended heavily on reeds, straw, dried palm branches, and animal dung for cooking fires. Children sometimes spent entire afternoons collecting usable fuel from roadsides or dry river edges. Nothing that could burn safely was ignored. Bundles of reeds rested beside ovens. Palm fibers dried on rooftops. Dung cakes hardened beneath the sun until ready for use. A cooking fire rarely looked large or dramatic. Most Egyptian meals cooked over controlled low flames or glowing coals rather than towering fires. Fuel needed careful use because replacing it required more labor tomorrow. An experienced cook understood how to stretch heat for as long as possible. After baking bread in a clay oven, leftover warmth might still cook beans slowly for hours. Hot ash could keep food warm deep into the evening. Heated stones continued radiating warmth after flames disappeared entirely. Cooking became less about powerful fire and more about patient heat. Near the edge of the village, a fisherman's wife cleaned small river fish beside a low wooden table darkened by years of water and scales. Her hands moved quickly. Flies gathered almost immediately in the growing warmth. Fresh fish spoiled fast in Egypt. Many families salted or dried fish whenever possible. Others cooked it immediately over small charcoal braziers. The fish might be wrapped in leaves or laid carefully across clay surfaces heated by coals. The smell of cooking fish drifted toward the river. Nearby, fishermen repaired torn nets while sitting quietly in the shade. Their skin looked darkened and rough from endless days beneath the sun and water glare. Most spoke little this early in the morning. They were already tired. The Nile gave food, but never easily. A little farther inland, workers carrying stone toward a construction site stopped briefly beside a roadside bread seller. The baker stood near a clay oven built into a mud wall blackened by smoke. Warm flat loaves rested in woven baskets beside him while ash clung to his bare arms. His work had started long before sunrise. Bread sellers often worked through the coolest hours of night and early morning. The ovens became unbearable later in the day once desert heat settled over the streets. Sweat already covered the baker's forehead while he moved loaves using rough cloth wrapped around his hands. Without long metal tools, bakers adapted however they could. Cloth. Wooden sticks. Broken pottery. Quick movements. Scarred fingers. Burns remained common. Still, the smell of fresh bread brought people steadily toward his oven. The workers traded small goods for loaves and continued walking through dusty streets toward unfinished walls rising slowly above the city. Egypt itself seemed built through exhaustion. Fields dug by tired hands. Canals cleared beneath brutal sunlight. Stone carried across sand. Meals cooked beside smoke and heat. Yet beneath all that labor, ordinary life continued quietly. Children still laughed beside riverbanks. Families still gathered together at night. People still paused to rest in the shade during the hottest hours. Near midday, the heat spread heavily across the valley once again. The sunlight reflected sharply from pale stone walls and dry ground. Air shimmered above rooftops. Dogs slept motionless beneath carts while even birds seemed too tired to sing. Inside kitchens and courtyards, fires became harder to endure. A cook stirring lentils over coals wiped sweat constantly from her face while smoke drifted into her eyes. Her linen clothing clung damply against her back. Nearby, a clay jar of water rested beneath wet cloth in hopes of keeping it cooler. The heavy afternoon heat slowed everything. Voices softened. Movements slowed. Even cooking itself became quieter. Many Egyptian meals during hot seasons relied on foods that required less active preparation during midday. Bread baked earlier could be eaten with cheese, dates, onions, or dried fish. Lentils cooked slowly over low coals without constant attention. Sometimes entire households rested briefly during the hottest hours. An old man might sleep against a shaded wall while children lay beside him listening to flies buzz lazily in the still air. Somewhere nearby, a cooking pot bubbled softly over nearly dead coals. The smell of warm grain drifted through the silence. Inside wealthier homes, servants continued working despite the heat. Large households required enormous amounts of food every day. Meat had to be prepared carefully before spoiling. Vegetables needed washing. Bread ovens demanded constant attention. Temple kitchens especially never truly stopped. Within large temple compounds, workers baked bread continuously for offerings, ceremonies, priests, and laborers. Smoke darkened ceilings high above crowded kitchens while servants moved through clouds of flour dust carrying trays, baskets, and jars. The ovens there glowed almost endlessly. One young worker fed reeds into a fire while another shaped dough nearby. An older cook stirred thick vegetable stew inside a huge clay pot blackened from years of use. Their world became heat and repetition. Firelight. Smoke. Sweat. Ash beneath bare feet. Outside the temple walls, ordinary village life moved more slowly. Women sat together repairing baskets or weaving mats beneath woven shade coverings. Small children chased one another through narrow lanes until the heat exhausted them. Water sellers walked carefully with heavy jars balanced against their shoulders. Everywhere, cooking remained close. No home stood far from smoke. As afternoon slowly faded toward evening, the atmosphere softened once more. Long shadows stretched across dusty roads. Farmers returned from the fields carrying tools across tired shoulders. Riverboats drifted toward shore through golden light reflecting across the Nile. And gradually, evening fires awakened again. These fires often felt calmer than morning ones. There was less urgency now. The day's hardest labor had ended. Families gathered together in courtyards or on rooftops while the sky darkened slowly above them. A mother tore warm bread beside a shallow bowl of lentils flavored with herbs and onion. Her husband sat nearby washing dust from his feet after a long day digging irrigation channels beside the river. Their youngest daughter leaned sleepily against his shoulder. An oil lamp flickered softly beside them. Beyond the rooftop edge, other families shared similar meals beneath the deepening evening sky. Smoke drifted upward from nearby homes while faint conversation moved through the warm darkness. The Nile reflected the first stars. Night carried its own rhythm in ancient Egypt. After sunset, the world became quieter but never fully silent. Somewhere, a donkey shifted against its rope. Somewhere else, fishermen pushed boats quietly into dark water hoping for cooler nighttime catches. Cooking fires glow gently beside homes like small stars scattered across the earth. The smell of ash lingered in the air long after meals ended. Children slowly disappeared indoors to sleep on woven mats. Older relatives remained awake a little longer, speaking softly about harvests, taxes, sickness, or the river's changing height. And always, before sleep, someone checked the fire. An elderly grandmother knelt carefully beside cooling coals. Her hands trembled slightly with age, but her movements remained practiced from decades of repetition. She spread pale ash slowly across the glowing embers until the red light disappeared beneath gray powder. Tomorrow's fire now rested hidden beneath the ash. Protected. Waiting. The courtyard darkened around her. Beyond the village, desert wind crossed empty sand beneath an endless field of stars. Farther away still, caravans moved slowly through moonlit darkness carrying grain, linen, oils, and stories between distant settlements. But here beside the Nile, ordinary families prepared quietly for another night of rest before the same labor returned with morning. The fires dimmed lower. The village softened into silence. And beneath the cooling ovens of ancient Egypt, tiny sleeping embers still glowed softly in the dark. The sleeping embers beneath the ash gave off just enough warmth to survive the night. Long before sunrise, while most of the Nile Valley still rested beneath darkness, faint red light remained hidden inside thousands of ancient Egyptian ovens. Quiet courtyards held the smell of old smoke and warm clay. Mud brick walls slowly released the heat gathered during the previous day, and somewhere beyond the village, the Nile moved patiently through the night. Then slowly, almost gently, the world began waking again. A rooster cried out from a distant rooftop. A dog barked once near the road. Palm leaves whispered softly in the breeze. Inside a small home near the riverbank, a woman opened her eyes before anyone else. The room around her remained dark except for a little moonlight slipping through the doorway. Her children still slept beside one another beneath thin linen cloths. Her husband rested heavily after yesterday's labor carrying grain sacks at the docks. For a few quiet moments, she simply listened. The river. The wind. Someone coughing in a nearby house. Then she rose carefully and stepped into the courtyard. The ground felt cool beneath her bare feet. The oven stood against the wall exactly where it always had, cracked slightly near the base from years of heat. Beside it rested a basket of dry reeds gathered 2 days earlier by her oldest son. She knelt slowly beside the ash. With careful fingers, she brushed away the pale gray layer covering the embers beneath. A tiny red glow answered her in the darkness. Still alive. She breathed softly against it. Smoke curled upward immediately, carrying that familiar smell of old fire waking once more. A few reeds snapped gently as small flames appeared. Another Egyptian morning had begun. Cooking without proper fire tools demanded patience more than strength. Egyptian cooks learned to move slowly and carefully around heat because burns and accidents were common. There were no thick gloves, no iron pokers, no controlled stove flames. Only fire itself. Direct. Unpredictable. A cook often used folded cloth, wooden branches, broken pottery, or even damp reeds to move hot objects. Hands became skilled through repetition. Fingers learned exactly how long they could safely touch warm clay before pain arrived. Many older cooks carried scars from years beside ovens and coals. Still, cooking remained deeply connected to comfort and survival. As the fire strengthened, the woman mixed flour and water inside a clay bowl worn smooth from many years of use. Her movements looked almost automatic now. She no longer needed to think carefully about the process. Her hands already remembered. Nearby, her youngest daughter slowly woke and wandered sleepily into the courtyard, rubbing her eyes. The child sat quietly beside the oven, watching the flames dance against the clay walls. This was how knowledge passed through generations. Not through lessons. Not through written instruction. But through quiet mornings beside the fire. The sky gradually turned pale blue above the Nile. One by one, other homes began releasing smoke into the dawn air. The village slowly filled with familiar sounds once again. Grinding stones. Footsteps. Water jars knocking softly together. Goats bleating behind mud walls. And beneath everything, the soft steady crackle of cooking fires. Along narrow roads, early workers already moved through the dim light, carrying tools over their shoulders. Farmers heading toward irrigation canals paused briefly at roadside ovens where bakers sold warm bread from woven baskets. The bakers themselves looked exhausted even before sunrise. Most had worked through the night preparing dough, feeding fires, and shaping loaves in unbearable heat. Their arms carried flour dust and ash. Their eyes appeared red from smoke and lack of sleep. Yet they continued steadily. Cities could not wake without bread. Near larger towns, the smell of baking spread through entire streets during early morning hours. Warm grain mixed with smoke, river mud, sweat, and the faint sweetness of dates being sold nearby. Donkeys moved slowly through the growing crowds, carrying fuel bundles and grain sacks. Children followed their parents through dusty lanes while scribes hurried toward temple buildings before the heat became too severe. Everything in Egyptian life revolved around timing. People learned to work early because midday heat drained strength from the body. Cooking especially became harder once the sun climbed fully into the sky. That was why so much preparation happened before dawn. Bread baked early. Beans simmered early. Beer carried before sunlight grew harsh. Water fetched before roads became crowded. Morning was precious. Near the edge of the village, a fisherman sat beside a small charcoal brazier cleaning the previous night's catch. The river behind him reflected pale golden light while insects hovered low above the reeds. He placed several fish carefully over the coals. The smell rose immediately into the cool air. Fish cooked quickly in Egypt, especially during warm months. A cook had to pay attention constantly because the heat from simple coals could change suddenly as fuel shifted or wind moved through the fire. The fisherman turned the fish using two thin sticks held carefully between rough fingers hardened by rope and water. Nearby, his wife prepared flat bread against the inside wall of their clay oven while their sons untangled damp fishing nets spread across the ground. Their entire morning unfolded beside smoke and river water. Near one canal, a young worker sat briefly in the shade of a palm tree eating bread still warm from the morning oven. Dust clung to his legs. Sweat already darkened the cloth around his neck. He ate slowly, listening to water moving beside him. Then, after only a short rest, he stood and returned to work. This was ordinary life in ancient Egypt. Not dramatic. Not grand. Simply endless labor shaped by river, heat, and hunger. Back inside the village, women continued working through the morning preparing larger meals for later hours. Clay pots rested over low fires while lentils softened slowly inside steaming water. Without strong metal cookware, Egyptian cooks understood how to use gentle heat over long periods. Stews cooked gradually beside glowing coals rather than fierce flames. Thick clay vessels held warmth well if protected carefully from sudden temperature changes. An experienced cook listened closely to food while it cooked. The sound mattered. A slow bubble meant steady heat. Violent boiling often meant wasted fuel and cracked pottery. Patience improved almost every meal. Near a larger estate belonging to a wealthy official, servants moved quickly through busy kitchens carrying baskets of herbs, onions, figs, and grain. The kitchens themselves felt crowded and hot even during early morning. Smoke floated beneath the ceiling. Oil lamps flickered in darker corners. Ash coated the floor beneath the ovens. One servant girl carried water jars from the Nile again and again while another ground spices beside a wall blackened from years of cooking fires. Their work seemed endless. Meals for wealthy households demanded more preparation than ordinary village cooking. Ducks, geese, vegetables, cakes, fruits, and fresh bread all required labor from many hands. Still, even these larger kitchens depended on the same simple forces as poorer homes: clay, fire, ash, patience. As midday approached, the sunlight grew harsh across the valley once again. The coolness of dawn disappeared completely. Heat settled heavily over rooftops, roads, fields, and riverbanks. Air shimmered above pale stone walls while dogs searched desperately for shade beneath carts and stairways. Cooking fires now felt almost unbearable. In small homes, women wiped sweat constantly from their faces while stirring pots over low coals. Some households delayed heavier cooking until evening because adding more heat to already overheated courtyards became exhausting. Still, certain foods needed attention throughout the day. Bread dough required shaping. Beer mixtures needed watching. Drying fish had to be protected from animals and insects. The work never fully stopped. Near temple complexes, kitchens remained especially active despite the heat. Priests required daily offerings of bread, beer, meat, fruit, and incense. Workers moved constantly through huge cooking areas carrying trays and jars while fires burned steadily inside rows of ovens. The temple kitchens smelled thick with grain and smoke. One elderly baker shaped loaves carefully while sweat rolled down his neck. His hands moved slowly but precisely after decades of repetition. Nearby, younger workers fed reeds and straw into the fires while trying not to cough from the smoke. Outside the temple walls, much of the city slowed beneath the afternoon heat. Merchants rested beneath woven coverings. Laborers sat silently in narrow strips of shade. Children slept indoors beside cooling water jars. Even the Nile itself seemed quieter beneath the white sunlight. Toward evening, life slowly returned to the streets. The sunlight softened from white to gold. Long shadows stretched beside homes and temple walls. Workers finally began returning from fields, docks, workshops, and construction sites. And once more, cooking fires brightened across Egypt. Evening cooking often carried a calmer feeling than the rushed labor of morning. Families gathered together gradually while the heat loosened its grip on the land. In one courtyard, a grandmother stirred lentils over a low fire while her grandchildren sat nearby listening to her speak softly about flood seasons from long ago. In another home, a tired fisherman repaired his nets while his wife baked flatbread against hot clay walls. The smell of onions and warm oil drifted through the darkening village. Oil lamps appeared one by one. Voices softened. Some families climbed to rooftops to eat where cooler breezes moved through the night air. Others remained in courtyards surrounded by mud walls still warm from sunlight. A father tore pieces of bread for his children while listening to distant music coming faintly from somewhere deeper in the town. Perhaps a wedding. Perhaps a festival. Or perhaps only workers singing softly together after a long day. The stars slowly emerged above them all. Bright. Endless. Ancient nights carried deep darkness once lamps burned low. The sky above Egypt appeared crowded with stars reflected faintly in the river below. Desert wind moved softly through palm leaves while insects hummed near the water. And across rooftops and courtyards, cooking fires slowly faded toward embers once again. Some people still worked late into the night. Bakers preparing tomorrow's dough. Boatmen arriving after dark. Temple servants cleaning cooking pots beside torchlight. But most families gradually settled into sleep. Before resting, someone always checked the fire carefully. A woman spread ash gently over glowing coals. A man stacked tomorrow's reeds beside the oven wall. A child carried empty clay bowls indoors. Then silence slowly returned. The fire dimmed lower beneath the ash. The village quieted beneath the stars. And somewhere beyond the sleeping homes, the Nile continued flowing patiently through the ancient night. The Nile flowed through the darkness like a long ribbon of black glass beneath the stars. Far above the quiet water, the sky stretched endlessly across the desert, filled with pale silver light from the moon and thousands of distant stars. The air had cooled slightly during the night, though warmth still lingered inside mud brick walls and stone courtyards where cooking fires had burned for many hours. Most of the village slept. Children lay curled beneath linen cloths. Workers rested beside walls still carrying the smell of smoke and dust from the day before. Oil lamps had mostly gone dark. Only a few faint orange glows remained beneath layers of ash where hidden embers waited patiently for morning. Ancient Egypt often felt gentlest during these late-night hours. The shouting of markets disappeared. The scraping of sandals along crowded roads faded away. Even the donkeys and goats became quiet beneath the soft desert wind. And somewhere in the stillness, a baker remained awake. Inside a narrow courtyard near the center of the village, he stood beside a clay oven warming slowly in the darkness. Sweat already glistened against his arms despite the hour. The oven radiated stored heat from fires burning earlier in the evening, and more fuel waited beside the wall in small careful bundles. The baker moved slowly to conserve energy. His day rarely followed ordinary hours. While most people slept, bakers often prepared dough, maintained ovens, and planned the next morning's work. Cities and villages needed bread before sunrise, especially when laborers left early for fields, riverboats, or construction sites. Without bread, the rhythm of Egyptian life stumbled. The baker mixed flour and water inside a broad clay bowl using tired hands coated with grain dust. The flour itself felt rough between his fingers. Tiny grains of stone from grinding tools mixed into nearly every batch. He no longer noticed. After years of labor, such details became ordinary. Nearby, his youngest son slept against the courtyard wall wrapped loosely in cloth. The child had tried to help earlier in the evening but grew too tired to continue shaping dough. The baker glanced toward him briefly while feeding more reeds into the fire. Tiny sparks floated upward into the darkness. The oven slowly brightened. In wealthier neighborhoods farther upriver, large household kitchens also remained active through the night. Servants prepared food for early morning rituals, traveling officials, or temple workers beginning duties before dawn. The kitchen smelled thick with smoke, oil, and warm grain. Clay jars lined the walls. Bundles of herbs hung drying from ceiling beams. Ash coated the floor beneath rows of ovens and braziers. One servant girl carried water from a courtyard well while another cleaned fish beside a dim oil lamp. Their movements remained quiet so they would not wake the household sleeping in nearby rooms. Even at night, cooking demanded constant attention. Fires could not simply be forgotten. Too much fuel wasted precious resources. Too little heat ruined tomorrow's bread. The balance required patience learned over many years. Near the Nile docks, boatmen arriving after dark warmed simple meals over portable charcoal braziers while sitting beside tied cargo boats. The river smelled damp and earthy beneath the moonlight. Reeds shifted softly along the banks while insects hovered above black water. One old sailor stirred lentils slowly inside a clay pot balanced over weak coals. His hands trembled slightly from age and exhaustion. Beside him rested coils of rope still wet from river spray. He had spent most of the day steering heavy grain boats downstream beneath relentless sunlight. His shoulders hurt deeply now. Still, he needed food before sleep. All across Egypt, tired bodies gathered near small fires during the night. Workers eating quietly. Families sharing late bread. Guards warming thin soup beside temple gates. The fires themselves seemed almost alive in the darkness, glowing softly against mud walls and drifting smoke into the night air. Hours later, the eastern sky slowly began changing color. The stars faded one by one. Birds called softly from somewhere beyond the reeds. And once again, Egypt prepared to wake. Morning arrived gently beside the Nile. Mist floated low above the riverbanks while fishermen untied boats from wooden posts. Water carriers stepped carefully along narrow paths balancing empty jars against their hips. Donkeys stamped their feet impatiently in shaded pens. And from the ovens of the village, fresh smoke rose into the pale blue sky. The baker who had worked through much of the night now pressed warm loaves into woven baskets while early customers gathered nearby. Laborers heading toward the fields bought bread still hot from the oven. Some carried onions tucked into cloth belts. Others held small jars of beer or dried fish for later meals. The street slowly filled with movement. Sandals against dust. Voices speaking softly. Children yawning beside doorways. Cooking shaped nearly every sound and smell of the morning. Near one small house, a mother prepared breakfast beside a low clay brazier rather than a full oven because fuel supplies had become limited that week. The brazier held only a small bed of charcoal glowing faintly beneath a clay pot. She added lentils carefully. A little onion. Some herbs gathered days earlier. The stew would cook slowly over weak heat while her family prepared for the day. Charcoal itself carried great value in ancient Egypt because it burned hotter and cleaner than many other fuels. But making charcoal required time and wood, so poorer households often used it sparingly. Most ordinary people depended instead on reeds, straw, palm branches, or dried dung. Fuel gathering became part of daily survival. Children wandered roads and dry river edges searching for anything useful to burn. Women saved scraps carefully after cooking. Even broken baskets or worn reed mats sometimes ended their lives as cooking fuel. Nothing could be wasted. By mid-morning, the village felt fully awake. The sun climbed steadily higher above the valley while workers disappeared toward fields and workshops. Dust rose from busy roads where merchants guided donkeys loaded with pottery, grain, and cloth. Inside homes, cooking continued. A grandmother shaped dough beside the doorway while watching two small children play nearby. Every few moments she glanced toward the oven where flat bread baked against heated clay walls. Her movements appeared slow but exact. She knew precisely when to remove the bread before it hardened too much. She knew how the fire sounded when fuel needed adding. She knew the smell of dough beginning to burn. These things lived inside her memory after decades beside the fire. Nearby, her daughter prepared beer inside large clay jars stored in the shade. Egyptian beer looked very different from modern beer. Thick and cloudy, it resembled liquid grain more than clear drink. Yet it nourished workers, filled stomachs, and helped preserve calories during difficult labor. Brewing required its own long process. Grain soaked. Bread crumbled into water. Mixtures fermented slowly inside sealed jars. Everything depended again on grain and careful heat. As the day grew hotter, smoke drifted lazily upward through still air above the village. The smell settled into clothing, hair, and skin. Most Egyptians likely carried the scent of cooking fires almost constantly. Their homes carried it too. Walls darkened from soot. Ceilings stained black above ovens. Sleeping mats absorbed years of smoke and ash. Modern comfort existed far away from this world. Yet there remained warmth here. Human warmth. The warmth of shared meals after hard labor. The warmth of bread passed from hand to hand. The warmth of tiny fires glowing against darkness while families rested together nearby. At midday, the heat pressed heavily over the Nile Valley once again. The sunlight reflected harshly from pale stone and dusty roads. Workers in the fields slowed their movements beneath the crushing brightness. Water shimmered in irrigation canals while insects buzzed above muddy banks. Inside kitchens, the fires felt almost unbearable. A cook wiping sweat from her face leaned over a clay pot bubbling beside weak coals. The air around her seemed thick enough to hold. Her linen clothing clung damply against her back. Still, the meal needed finishing. Children would soon return hungry. Her husband would arrive exhausted from labor. Food could not wait simply because the heat became difficult. This truth shaped much of Egyptian life. The work always continued. Near temple kitchens, laborers carried baskets of fuel through clouds of flour dust while priests passed silently through cooler stone corridors nearby. Huge ovens burned steadily, filling the air with the smell of baking bread and smoke. One young servant accidentally brushed bare skin against hot clay and pulled away sharply with a quiet cry. Burns happened often. The older workers barely looked up. Such accidents belonged to ordinary life. A little farther away, along the riverbank, fishermen spread cleaned fish across wooden racks to dry beneath the sun. Salt glittered faintly against the flesh while flies gathered constantly nearby. Preserving food mattered deeply in the heat. Anything left exposed too long risked spoiling quickly. Dates dried on woven mats. Herbs hung from shaded beams. Grain stored inside sealed jars. Egyptian households learned carefully how to stretch food across days, weeks, and seasons. Toward evening, relief slowly returned to the valley. The sunlight softened. Long shadows crossed roads and courtyards. Workers finally began walking home through dusty streets carrying tools over tired shoulders. And once more, the fires brightened across Egypt. Evening cooking brought familiar comforts. The smell of onions frying in oil. Warm bread breaking apart between rough hands. Stew simmering gently beside low coals. Children sitting sleepily near the firelight. A father washed dust from his face beside a clay jar while listening to distant voices drifting through the warm air. Nearby, his wife turned bread carefully inside the oven using folded cloth wrapped around her fingers. Above them, the first stars appeared slowly in the darkening sky. Night approached gently once again. The heat loosened. The village quieted. Families gathered close beside fading fires while the Nile moved endlessly through the darkness beyond. The night settled softly across the Nile Valley while the last cooking fires of the evening glowed low beneath the stars. From a distance, the villages beside the river looked quiet and still, their mud brick homes blending gently into the darkness. Only faint points of orange light remained where embers continued breathing beneath layers of ash. Smoke drifted slowly upward into the warm night air and disappeared beneath the endless sky. The river itself reflected the moon like polished stone. Palm trees stood motionless along the banks. Somewhere far away, a boatman called softly through the darkness before silence returned again. Inside one small house near the edge of a farming village, an elderly woman remained awake after the others had fallen asleep. Her grandchildren rested together on woven mats nearby while the youngest child murmured softly in his dreams. The old woman sat beside the oven with tired hands folded in her lap. She listened to the quiet crackle of hidden coals beneath the ash. Most of her life had passed beside cooking fires. She had learned to bake bread as a child while standing beside her mother before sunrise. She had spent years grinding grain until her shoulders stiffened and her fingers thickened from labor. Smoke had touched her lungs every day for decades. Now age moved slowly through her body. Her knees hurt when she stood. Her back ached in the mornings. But even now, she still trusted herself more than anyone else to care for the household fire through the night. Carefully, she reached forward and added another thin layer of ash over the glowing embers. Not too much. Not too little. Enough to keep the heat alive until dawn. This knowledge seemed simple, but it mattered deeply. Without preserved embers, tomorrow's cooking would become harder. Starting a completely new fire demanded time, effort, and luck, especially during windy weather or damp flood seasons when dry fuel became difficult to find. So families protected fire carefully. Almost lovingly. The old woman finally rose and stepped outside into the courtyard. The night air felt warmer than it should have, carrying the smell of river mud, dry reeds, and distant smoke. Above her, the stars stretched endlessly across the Egyptian sky. For a few moments she simply stood there listening. Water moving somewhere beyond the village. Insects humming softly near the walls. A donkey shifting in its sleep. Then she returned inside and lay down beside her sleeping family while the hidden embers continued glowing quietly beneath the ash. Hours passed gently through the darkness. Then slowly, the eastern sky began to pale once more. Another day approached. Ancient Egypt awakened gradually. First came the birds calling from the reeds beside the Nile. Then the sounds of footsteps outside. A cough from a nearby house. The soft scrape of pottery against stone. And soon after, smoke rose once again from the first waking ovens. Near the center of the village, a young mother stepped into her courtyard carrying a basket of dried palm fibers and brittle reeds gathered the day before. Her baby rested against her shoulder wrapped loosely in cloth while her older daughter still slept indoors. She knelt beside the oven and uncovered the buried embers. A faint glow waited beneath the ash. Still alive. She smiled quietly to herself. The morning air felt cool against her skin as she fed small pieces of fuel into the ember. Thin flames slowly returned, lighting the clay walls with soft orange color. Soon the familiar smells of cooking drifted across the village once again. Warm grain. Smoke. Hot clay. Fresh dough. The smells blended naturally with the damp scent of the river nearby. Egyptian mornings often carried a strange peace before the day's labor fully arrived. Workers had not yet begun shouting across fields or hauling stone beneath the sun. The roads remained mostly empty except for water carriers and early bakers. For a little while, the world still felt gentle. Inside homes, women prepared bread dough while children slowly woke around them. Some families mixed barley flour because wheat had become too expensive or difficult to obtain. Others stretched smaller amounts of grain by making thinner loaves. People adapted constantly according to harvests, taxes, and flood conditions. The Nile controlled much of life. A good flood season brought rich soil and stronger harvests. A poor flood brought worry. And worry changed cooking immediately. Families used less grain. Meals became smaller. Fuel was guarded more carefully. Even the mood inside homes shifted quietly during difficult seasons. Near the riverbank, fishermen returned from nighttime work carrying damp nets over tired shoulders. Their small boats drifted gently against wooden posts while the sky brightened behind them. One fisherman sat immediately beside a low charcoal brazier to prepare the morning meal before sleeping. His eyes looked heavy with exhaustion. River insects still clung to his clothing. He cleaned several small fish with practiced movements while smoke from the brazier drifted into the cool air. Nearby, his wife baked coarse flat bread against the hot inner wall of their oven. The children waited patiently nearby. Food always tasted better after long labor. As the sun slowly climbed above the horizon, the village grew louder and busier. Farmers carrying tools disappeared toward green fields beyond the houses. Donkeys loaded with grain baskets moved through narrow roads. Merchants opened shaded stalls selling onions, dates, oil, or dried fish. And everywhere, fires burned quietly beside homes and workshops. Cooking in ancient Egypt rarely happened in silence. The sound of bubbling lentils, the crackle of straw, the tapping of clay lids, grinding stones scraping steadily. These sounds belong to daily life as naturally as river water or desert wind. Near a busy bakery, several workers shaped bread rapidly while sweat already formed across their arms. The ovens there radiated fierce heat even during early morning. One baker pressed dough against the oven wall using quick practiced movements. Another removed finished loaves with folded cloth wrapped around his hands. Without proper metal tools, speed mattered. The faster the movement, the fewer burns. Still, scars covered many bakers' fingers and wrists. The work remained dangerous despite experience. Yet people kept returning for bread while it was warm. Laborers bought loaves before heading toward construction sites where long days carrying stone already waited. Scribes purchased smaller portions while walking toward temple offices. Children carried bread home carefully inside woven baskets balanced against their hips. Fresh bread held deep comfort in Egyptian life, especially during difficult times. Near midday, the sunlight sharpened across the valley once again. Heat spread over roads, rooftops, canals, and courtyards with heavy force. The air itself felt tired. Inside homes, cooks moved more slowly now. Sweat darkened linen clothing while smoke lingered low beneath shaded cooking spaces. One woman stirred lentils inside a clay pot while her elderly father rested nearby against the wall. His breathing sounded rough after many years inhaling dust from grain work and smoke from cooking fires. Life in ancient Egypt often wore the body down slowly. Not through sudden violence, but through repetition. Years of bending over fields. Years of carrying water. Years beside ovens. Years walking dusty roads beneath endless sunlight. Cooking itself demanded constant physical effort. A meal began long before the fire. Someone needed to gather fuel. Someone carried water. Someone harvested grain. Someone ground flour. Someone shaped clay vessels. Only then could cooking finally begin. And even after eating, more labor waited. Cleaning pots. Saving ashes. Protecting leftover embers. Preparing tomorrow's grain. The cycle never fully ended. Near a temple kitchen farther upriver, workers prepared large quantities of bread for offerings and ceremonies. Rows of clay ovens glowed brightly while servants carried baskets through smoke-filled rooms. The heat inside felt overwhelming. One young servant paused briefly beside a water jar, wiping sweat from her face before returning to the ovens. Nearby, another worker stirred vegetable stew with a long wooden branch because proper cooking tools remained scarce. Even large temples relied heavily on simple methods. Clay, wood, ash, human hands. Outside, priests walked through cooler stone halls while cooks and bakers continued sweating beside the fires. Toward late afternoon, shadows finally began stretching longer across the village roads. Workers returned slowly from fields and workshops covered in dust and exhaustion. Children ran to greet fathers returning home. Women prepared evening meals. Smoke thickened once again above rooftops. Evening cooking often brought softer feelings than morning labor. The urgency faded. People moved more slowly now beneath the golden light. On one rooftop, a family gathered around a shallow bowl of lentils flavored with onion and herbs. Warm bread rested nearby wrapped in cloth to keep it soft. The father spoke quietly about the river level while his wife listened beside the fading heat of a small brazier. Their youngest child leaned against her shoulder nearly asleep. Around them, the village settled gradually into evening calm. Oil lamps flickered inside doorways. Voices drifted softly through warm air. The smell of smoke lingered everywhere. Above the rooftops, the first stars slowly appeared once again over ancient Egypt. And far below them all, hidden beneath ovens across the Nile Valley, tomorrow's embers already waited patiently beneath the ash. The stars above the Nile Valley shimmered softly in the warm darkness while the village settled deeper into silence. Cooking fires had grown smaller now. Most evening meals had ended. Clay bowls sat empty beside doorways, and the smell of warm bread still lingered faintly in the night air. Somewhere nearby, an old man quietly cleared his throat before turning over on his sleeping mat. Beyond the mud brick homes, the Nile moved patiently beneath the moonlight. The river never hurried. It flowed through Egypt the same way it had flowed for countless generations before these people were born. Quiet water slipped past reeds, fishing boats, temple docks, and sleeping villages while the desert stretched endlessly beyond the fertile valley. And inside the homes beside that river, ordinary people rested their tired bodies before another day of labor would begin again. Near the edge of one village, a young servant girl remained awake later than the others. She worked inside the kitchen courtyard of a wealthy household where preparations for the next day had already begun. The courtyard still felt hot from the ovens. Even at night, warmth radiated slowly from the clay walls and stone floor beneath her feet. Ash covered parts of the ground in pale gray dust while stacks of fuel waited carefully beneath a shaded awning nearby. She carried empty clay bowls toward a washing basin filled earlier from the Nile. The water already felt warm. Her hands moved slowly from exhaustion. She had spent the entire day carrying grain, grinding flour, cleaning vegetables, and feeding reeds into the fires. Smoke had stung her eyes since before dawn. Her shoulders hurt from lifting heavy jars. Still, there was more work before sleep. The kitchen needed cleaning. Tomorrow's fuel needed arranging. The embers needed protecting beneath ash. Large households depended completely on invisible labor like hers. Most wealthy Egyptians rarely saw the full effort required to keep kitchens running smoothly. Servants woke long before sunrise and often slept after everyone else. Their lives passed beside ovens, storage jars, smoke, and endless repetition. Yet even in these harder lives, quiet moments still existed. As the servant girl rinsed bowls beneath the moonlight, she paused briefly and looked toward the sky above the courtyard wall. The stars looked beautiful tonight. A soft wind moved through nearby palm leaves. For a few moments, the kitchen became peaceful. Then she returned to work. Farther away along the Nile banks, fishermen slept beside tide boats while damp nets dried nearby. Some had returned only a few hours earlier from nighttime fishing beneath the stars. Their bodies smelled of river water, wet rope, fish scales, and smoke from simple meals cooked before rest. One older fisherman slept lightly beside a tiny charcoal brazier still glowing faintly in the darkness. Beside him rested half a loaf of bread wrapped carefully in cloth for tomorrow morning. Food could never be wasted. Not bread. Not fish. Not fuel. The Nile gave much, but survival still demanded caution. Hours passed slowly through the night. Then at last, the eastern horizon began turning pale once again. The stars faded one by one above the desert. Birds called softly from the reeds. And Egypt slowly awakened. Morning returned first through sound. Grinding stones scraping grain. Sandals brushing dusty ground. Water jars knocking together softly. The low murmur of voices in narrow streets. Then came the smoke. Thin gray trails rose from courtyards and rooftops as families uncovered hidden embers beneath ash and coaxed them gently back into flame. Near one small home, a mother and her teenage son worked together beside the morning fire. The boy fed dry reeds carefully into the oven while she shaped flat rounds of dough with quick practiced hands. The boy had recently become strong enough to help more with fuel gathering and oven work. His arms carried small burns from learning too quickly around hot clay. But he no longer pulled away from the heat as he once had. Egyptian children learned early. They learned how smoke felt in the eyes. How to judge warmth from glowing coals. How to carry clay pots carefully without cracking them. How to move through kitchens crowded with heat and fire. These lessons became part of growing up. The smell of baking bread soon drifted through the waking village. Warm grain. Smoke. Hot clay. A little onion frying somewhere nearby. The smells mixed naturally with the scent of river mud carried on the morning breeze. As sunlight spread slowly across the Nile Valley, workers began moving toward fields and workshops once again. Farmers carried wooden tools over their shoulders. Boatmen untied ropes along the docks. Merchants opened market stalls beneath woven coverings. And nearly everyone carried food prepared beside those morning fires. Simple meals. Bread wrapped in cloth. Dates stored in baskets. Dried fish. Beans or lentils cooked before sunrise. Without these meals, the day's labor would become impossible beneath the Egyptian heat. Near the village bakery, activity already filled the narrow street. Bakers moved quickly beside blazing ovens while customers gathered impatiently nearby. The heat there felt intense even this early. One baker wiped sweat from his forehead with a flour-covered arm while reaching deep inside the oven using folded cloth wrapped around his hand. Another shaped dough rapidly against a wooden board blackened from years of use. Their work required speed and endurance. The ovens consumed fuel constantly. Palm fibers burned quickly. Reeds crackled fast and bright. Dung burned longer but produced thicker smoke. Each fuel changed the fire differently, and experienced bakers understood these differences instinctively. A younger worker added too much straw at once, causing flames to leap suddenly from the oven mouth. The older baker immediately pulled him back with a tired shake of the head. Small mistakes around fire carried real danger. Nearby, laborers waited with woven baskets to carry bread toward construction sites farther upriver. Massive stone projects demanded enormous food supplies every single day. Behind every temple wall and carved monument stood countless ordinary meals prepared beside humble fires. Workers hauling stone beneath brutal sunlight needed strength simply to continue moving. And strength came from bread. From lentils. From beer. From food cooked slowly through smoke and heat by unseen hands. By midday, the valley once again shimmered beneath harsh sunlight. The roads looked almost white beneath the brightness. Heat pressed against walls and rooftops until even breathing felt heavier. Cooking during these hours became exhausting. In one courtyard, a woman sat beside a low brazier stirring beans while trying to shield her face from the smoke drifting back toward her. Her youngest child slept nearby beneath a woven shade covering while flies buzzed lazily through the thick air. The woman moved slowly now. The heat drained energy from every task. Even lifting water jars felt difficult by afternoon. Still, food needed preparing. Her husband would soon return briefly from canal work for the midday meal. The older children would arrive hungry from carrying grain at the market. So she continued feeding tiny pieces of fuel into the brazier. A little at a time. Careful not to waste anything. Near larger cities, street sellers continued cooking despite the heat. Small portable braziers lined busy roads while merchants sold roasted fish, onions, bread, or thick beer to passing workers. Smoke drifted low between crowded buildings. Donkeys pushed slowly through narrow lanes. Dust floated through bright sunlight. The city smelled alive with cooking. Not rich cooking. Not luxurious cooking. Just the endless smell of ordinary survival. Farther away inside temple kitchens, servants prepared offerings while sweating beside rows of ovens. Huge amounts of bread baked daily for rituals honoring the gods and feeding temple workers. The kitchens thundered softly with activity. Grinding stones turning. Clay lids knocking. Fire crackling beneath large cooking pots. Young servants hurried through clouds of flour dust carrying baskets heavier than their thin arms could comfortably manage. The older workers rarely spoke much. Most saved their energy for the labor itself. Toward evening, relief finally began returning to the land. The sunlight softened from white to gold. Long shadows stretched across fields and roads while workers slowly made their way home through the dusty warmth. And once again, smoke thickened above the rooftops. Evening fires often burned slower than morning ones. There was less urgency now. Families gathered together while lentils simmered quietly over low coals. Bread warmed gently beside clay walls. Children sat nearby listening to the sounds of the village settling into night. An elderly grandfather rested on a rooftop while his daughter prepared the evening meal nearby. He watched the sky darken above the Nile while rubbing sore hands hardened by many years of farming. The smell of onions cooking drifted upward around them. Somewhere farther away, faint music carried through the warm evening air. Perhaps a celebration. Perhaps travelers singing beside the river. Or perhaps only workers trying to ease the heaviness of another long day. The stars slowly returned above ancient Egypt. Oil lamps flickered softly in courtyards below. Cooking fires dimmed toward glowing embers. And across the Nile Valley, ordinary families once again prepared quietly for sleep beside the warmth of fading ovens. The warm night air drifted slowly through the village while the last voices of the evening faded into silence. Above the Nile Valley, the stars looked bright enough to touch. They stretched across the dark sky in endless numbers, reflected faintly in the slow black water of the river below. Palm trees stood still beside the banks, their shadows long and soft beneath the moonlight. Most homes had grown quiet now. Children slept beside mud brick walls still warm from the day's heat. Workers rested heavily after hours spent in fields, workshops, kitchens, and riverboats. Oil lamps flickered low beside sleeping mats before finally fading into darkness. Only the embers remained awake. Hidden beneath pale layers of ash inside ovens across Egypt, tiny red glows still breathed softly through the night. Near a narrow street close to the market district, an old baker sat alone beside his cooling oven. The heat from the clay still warmed the courtyard around him. Flour dust covered his arms and feet. His back ached deeply after another long day shaping bread for laborers and merchants. He no longer remembered how many years he had worked beside ovens. Perhaps 30. Perhaps 40. The days had blended together through smoke, heat, and repetition. Yet there was comfort in the routine. He listened quietly to the sounds of the sleeping city while slowly tearing apart a piece of leftover bread for his evening meal. The bread had already hardened slightly in the cooling night air, but he ate it carefully anyway. Nothing useful could be wasted. Beside him rested a small bowl of lentils cooked earlier over weak coals. The smell of onion and herbs still lingered faintly above the bowl. For a few moments, the baker simply sat in silence. No shouting customers. No crackling fires demanding fuel. No workers waiting impatiently for warm loaves. Only the soft wind moving through distant alleyways and the steady warmth of the oven beside him. Ancient Egypt rarely became truly peaceful during the day. There was always labor. Always heat. Always dust and movement and noise. But late at night, after the fires burned low, the world softened. Even the river seemed quieter then. Farther along the Nile, several fishermen rested beside tide boats while damp nets hung nearby to dry. One young fisherman still remained awake repairing torn rope beneath the light of a small oil lamp. His fingers moved slowly from exhaustion. The lamp flame flickered gently whenever the wind touched it. Beside him, a tiny charcoal brazier glowed with fading heat. Earlier he had cooked fish over those coals while listening to older fishermen speak softly about river currents and changing flood patterns. Now the coals dimmed slowly toward ash. The young fisherman looked toward the dark water for a long moment. Tomorrow before dawn he would return to the river again. The work never truly ended. In wealthier homes, servants still moved quietly through kitchen courtyards preparing for the morning ahead. Grain needed soaking. Fuel needed arranging. Clay bowls required cleaning before sunrise brought another wave of cooking. One servant woman carried reeds into a storage area beside the ovens while fighting sleep with heavy eyes. Her feet hurt from standing all day on hard stone floors warmed by constant fires. The kitchen smelled thick with old smoke and warm clay. She stacked the reeds carefully. Dry fuel mattered too much to leave exposed to night dampness. Then she crossed the courtyard toward the ovens and gently spread ash over the glowing embers inside. Not enough to smother them completely. Only enough to preserve the hidden heat until morning. This small act repeated itself every night across Egypt. Quiet hands protecting tomorrow's fire. Hours passed beneath the stars. The village slept. The river flowed. And slowly, almost unnoticed, the eastern sky began turning pale once again. Morning returned softly over the Nile Valley. Mist hovered above the riverbanks while birds stirred among the reeds. The coolness before sunrise felt brief but precious after long days of heat. Inside homes, people began waking one by one. A child rolled sleepily onto one side. A woman sat up slowly beside her family. An old laborer stretched aching shoulders before standing carefully from his mat. And soon after, the fires awakened too. Near one small riverside home, a mother uncovered the hidden embers beneath ash while her two daughters prepared flour nearby. The girls worked quietly, still heavy with sleep, as grinding stones scraped steadily through the dim morning light. The sound belonged to Egypt itself. Stone against stone. Grain becoming flour. The beginning of bread. The mother leaned close to the embers and blew gently. Smoke curled upward. Then came the first tiny flames. Soon the courtyard filled with familiar smells once more. Warm ash. Burning reeds. Fresh dough. Morning always smelled alive beside the Nile. As the sky brightened, more smoke drifted upward across the village. Water carriers walked toward the river balancing empty clay jars against their hips. Farmers gathered tools before heading toward the canals and fields. The road slowly filled with movement. Sandals brushing dust. Donkeys carrying grain sacks. Workers speaking quietly in the cool dawn air. And everywhere, cooks prepared food before the heat arrived. Near the market district, bakers had already begun working long before sunrise. The ovens there glowed brightly against smoke-darkened walls while laborers lined up for fresh bread. One baker pressed flat dough against the hot inner wall of the oven using quick practiced movements. Another removed finished loaves with folded cloth wrapped around burned fingers. Sweat already covered their skin despite the early hour. The ovens gave off fierce heat even before sunrise fully arrived. Yet the smell of fresh bread drifting through the streets brought comfort to tired workers beginning another long day. A stone carrier purchased 2 warm loaves before walking toward a construction site beyond the city edge. Dust already covered his sandals. He would spend the day hauling limestone beneath harsh sunlight. But for now, he walked slowly through the cool morning air with warm bread tucked beneath his arm. Simple things mattered deeply in ancient life. Warm bread. Cool water. Shade at midday. A fire still alive at dawn. Near the edge of the village, fishermen cleaned their morning catch beside the river. Flies gathered immediately in the growing warmth while smoke from nearby braziers drifted low across the water. One fisherman's wife roasted fish carefully over weak coals while stirring lentils in a clay pot beside her. Her youngest child sat nearby watching silently. The child's eyes followed every movement. How much fuel to add? When to turn the fish? How close the pot should sit near the heat? This was how cooking knowledge survived. Quiet observation beside ordinary fires. No lessons needed. No written instruction. Only years of watching and helping. By mid-morning, the heat had already begun spreading across the valley again. Sunlight reflected brightly from stone walls and dusty roads while insects buzzed heavily above irrigation canals. Inside homes, cooking became harder. Smoke lingered in still air. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Clay ovens radiated fierce warmth into crowded courtyards. One elderly woman sat beside a low brazier cooking beans slowly while rubbing pain from her knees between tasks. Years spent kneeling beside ovens had stiffened her joints badly. Still, she continued working. Families depended on these quiet efforts every day. Near temple kitchens, workers moved steadily through clouds of flour dust carrying baskets of grain and bundles of reeds. The ovens there burned almost constantly to supply bread for priests, offerings, and laborers attached to the temple grounds. Huge clay pots bubbled over glowing coals while cooks stirred them using long wooden branches blackened by heat. The air smelled thick with grain and smoke. One young worker coughed repeatedly while feeding straw into an oven mouth glowing orange inside the darkness. No one paused. The labor continued. Ancient Egyptian cooking demanded endurance more than comfort. Everything required physical effort. Water had to be carried. Fuel gathered. Fires maintained. Food protected from insects and spoilage. Nothing happened easily. Yet despite the endless work, evening still arrived gently each day. As sunlight softened toward gold, workers slowly returned home through dusty roads lined with smoke rising from evening fires. Children ran beside them. Dogs barked lazily in narrow lanes. The smell of onions frying in oil drifted through the village once more. Families gathered on rooftops or in small courtyards where faint breezes moved through the warm air. Bread warmed beside low coals while lentils simmered quietly nearby. An old grandmother tore pieces of bread carefully for her grandchildren while listening to distant music drifting across the river. Perhaps a festival somewhere farther downstream. Perhaps boatmen singing while working late. The sounds floated softly through the darkness before fading again. Above them all, the stars slowly returned to the Egyptian sky. Cooking fires dimmed lower. Oil lamps flickered softly against mud walls. And beneath the cooling ovens, tomorrow's hidden embers already waited patiently beneath the ash. The Nile River moved quietly beneath the stars while the village drifted deeper into sleep. The air carried the lingering smell of smoke, warm clay, river mud, and baked grain. Above the rooftops, the night sky stretched endlessly across the dark desert, heavy with silver stars reflected faintly in the slow black water below. Most fires had burned low now. Only small orange glows remained hidden beneath layers of pale ash inside ovens resting against courtyard walls. The heat trapped inside the clay faded slowly into the darkness, warming the nearby ground where children and old dogs sometimes slept during cooler nights. Inside one small riverside house, a father rested beside his family after a long day repairing irrigation canals. His hands still carried dried mud beneath the fingernails. His shoulders ached deeply from lifting wet earth beneath the afternoon sun. Beside him, his wife slept lightly. Years of waking before dawn had trained her body to listen constantly for the smallest sounds around the fire. Even in sleep, part of her mind remained near the oven waiting for morning. The room smelled faintly of smoke and fresh bread baked earlier that evening. Near the doorway, a clay bowl still held a few remaining lentils from supper. Nothing had been wasted. Nothing ever could be. Ancient Egyptian life depended on careful use of everything. Grain took too much labor to throw away. Fuel required too much gathering. Water demanded too many trips to the Nile beneath heavy sunlight. Even ash itself remained useful. Old cooking ash cleaned pots, covered embers, dried damp ground, and sometimes mixed into other household work. Every part of the fire continued serving a purpose long after the flames disappeared. Outside, a soft desert wind moved through the village lanes. Somewhere in the distance, a donkey shifted against its rope. Then silence returned again. Farther downriver, in a larger city crowded with workshops and markets, several bakers still worked through the night beside enormous clay ovens. Their courtyards glowed orange beneath firelight while smoke drifted upward between dark buildings. The heat there felt heavy even at midnight. One young baker pressed dough against the oven wall while sweat rolled slowly down his neck. Nearby, another worker carried baskets of dry reeds stacked almost taller than himself. The fires needed constant feeding. Large bakeries consumed fuel endlessly. Straw burned quickly. Palm branches burned hotter. Charcoal lasted longer but cost more. Experienced bakers learned how each material changed the heat inside the oven. They watched flames carefully. They listened to the sound of the fire breathing through the clay opening. Without thermometers or metal controls, the oven itself became something almost alive. Something understood through years of closeness. The older bakers could often judge heat simply from the color inside the oven mouth or the smell rising from the baking dough. These were quiet skills learned slowly over a lifetime. Nearby, laborers sleeping beside unfinished temple walls would soon wake hungry before dawn. The bakers understood this well. Workers needed bread. The city depended on bread. And so the fires continued burning through the night. Along the Nile banks, fishermen slept beside tide boats while moonlight shimmered across the water. Nets lay spread nearby drying slowly in the warm air. One older fisherman remained awake beside a tiny charcoal brazier. He stared silently at the river while warming leftover fish over weak coals. His face looked worn from years beneath sun and river wind. Fishing demanded endless patience. Long nights. Heavy nets. Mosquitoes drifting above still water. Hours spent rowing beneath crushing heat. Yet even now, in the quiet middle of the night, he still needed to prepare food before tomorrow's labor arrived. Cooking never fully disappeared from Egyptian life. It touched every hour, every season, every family. Hours later, darkness slowly loosened its hold over the valley. The eastern horizon turned pale blue behind distant palms. Birds began calling softly from the reeds. And once more, the hidden embers beneath the ash awakened across Egypt. Morning fires returned gently. A woman stepped into her courtyard carrying dry straw gathered the previous afternoon by her children. The ground beneath her feet still held some coolness from the night. She knelt beside the oven and brushed away ash carefully. A red glow waited beneath. Still alive. She smiled quietly and fed the ember tiny pieces of straw. Thin smoke curled upward immediately. Soon small flames danced inside the clay chamber while the first morning sounds drifted through the village. Grinding stones. Footsteps. Water jars clinking softly together. Distant voices speaking near the river. The day had begun again. Nearby, her oldest daughter mixed flour and water inside a broad clay bowl. Fine grain dust coated her hands and wrists while she worked. She had learned these movements by watching her mother for many years. No one needed to explain the process anymore. Her body already understood. The dough pressed softly beneath her fingers while the oven slowly gathered heat nearby. The smell of smoke mixed with cool morning air drifting through the courtyard. For a brief time before sunrise fully arrived, the world felt calm. Then gradually, more fires awakened across the village. Smoke rose above rooftops in thin gray lines. Bread baked against hot clay walls. Fish roasted over small braziers. Beans simmered quietly inside blackened cooking pots. The smells spread everywhere. Warm grain. Ash. Onion. Oil. River mud carried on damp morning wind. These smells formed the atmosphere of ordinary Egyptian life more than anything else. Not gold. Not temples. Not palaces. But smoke drifting through dawn beside the Nile. As sunlight climbed higher, workers began moving toward fields and workshops once again. Farmers carried tools across their shoulders while builders walked slowly toward construction sites beyond the village. Most carried food prepared before sunrise. Bread wrapped carefully in cloth. Dates stored in baskets. Onions tucked beside belts. Thick beer carried inside clay jars. Without these simple meals, long hours beneath the sun became unbearable. Near one roadside bakery, workers crowded around warm ovens while bakers moved rapidly through clouds of flour dust and smoke. One baker reached deep into the oven using folded cloth wrapped around his hand. Another slapped fresh dough against the hot inner wall with practiced speed. The air around them shimmered with heat. Even early in the morning, sweat covered their skin. Still, people continued arriving for bread. A mother carrying a sleeping child. A stone worker beginning his long walk toward the quarry. A temple servant sent to collect loaves for morning offerings. Bread connected every level of Egyptian life. The rich ate finer bread. The poor ate rough bread. But nearly everyone depended on it. By late morning, the heat settled heavily over the valley once again. Sunlight reflected sharply from pale walls and dusty roads. Dogs searched for narrow strips of shade while insects buzzed lazily above irrigation canals. Inside kitchens and courtyards, fires became harder to endure. A woman cooking lentils beside weak coals wiped sweat from her face repeatedly while trying to keep smoke away from her sleeping baby nearby. The clay pot bubbled slowly. Fuel had to be added carefully. Too much wasted precious reeds. Too little delayed the meal. Cooking without proper tools required constant attention. Even moving a pot demanded caution. Thick cloth protected hands only briefly from the heat. Broken pottery fragments sometimes lifted hot lids. Wooden branches stirred large pots blackened by years of smoke. Simple objects became important tools through necessity. Near temple kitchens, servants prepared enormous quantities of food for rituals and workers. The ovens there burned steadily all day long while grain dust floated through shafts of sunlight cutting across the smoky rooms. One elderly cook stirred vegetable stew slowly while younger workers carried baskets of fuel from storage areas nearby. The older man's arms moved carefully. Years beside fires had stiffened his joints and scarred his skin. Yet he still trusted himself more than anyone else to judge the heat properly. Experience mattered deeply in Egyptian kitchens. A careless cook wasted food. Cracked pots. Burned bread. Destroyed precious fuel. But experienced hands kept households alive. Toward evening, shadows slowly stretched across the roads once more. Workers returned from the fields exhausted and dust-covered while the harsh brightness softened into golden light. And again, fires brightened across the Nile Valley. The smell of supper drifted gently through the village. Onions frying in oil. Fresh bread warming beside coals. Fish roasting slowly. Lentils simmering inside clay pots. Families gathered together on rooftops and in courtyards while faint breezes moved through the warm air. An old grandmother sat quietly beside the evening fire watching her grandchildren eat. Their faces glowed softly in the flickering light while the stars slowly appeared overhead. Beyond the village, the Nile flowed endlessly through the darkness. And beneath the ovens warming the ancient night, tomorrow's hidden embers already waited beneath the ash. The evening breeze moved softly across the Nile while darkness settled once again over the valley. Smoke drifted upward from hundreds of fading fires, rising slowly above mud brick rooftops before disappearing into the star-filled sky. The day's heat still lingered inside walls and courtyards, trapped deep within clay ovens that had burned since before dawn. Families rested beside those ovens now. Some sat quietly together on rooftops where the air felt cooler. Others remained in small courtyards lit only by weak oil lamps and glowing coals. Children leaned sleepily against parents whose bodies still ached from the long day of labor. The smell of warm bread and smoke lingered everywhere. Near one crowded village lane, a mother carefully folded cloth over the last pieces of bread remaining from supper. The loaves had already hardened slightly in the cooling air, but they would still feed the family tomorrow morning if softened near the fire. Beside her, her husband repaired a worn sandal strap while listening to distant sounds drifting from somewhere near the river. A dog barking. Boatmen speaking softly. The slow splash of water against wooden docks. Their youngest child slept nearby with flour still dusted faintly across his hands from helping shape dough earlier that day. Even children carried traces of cooking work in ancient Egypt. Smoke in their hair. Ash on their feet. Small burns on curious fingers learning too quickly around heat. The knowledge entered life early. Long before children understood politics, religion, or kings, they understood fire. They understood the smell of bread nearly ready. The sting of smoke in tired eyes. The sound of bubbling lentils over weak coals. These ordinary lessons shaped daily life more deeply than grand events ever could. Farther down the village road, an elderly widower sat alone beside a tiny brazier glowing softly in the darkness. His home remained quiet now after many years of raising children who had since moved into homes of their own. Still, each night he prepared his simple meal carefully. A little bread. A few onions. Beans cooked slowly in a clay pot blackened from decades of smoke. His hands moved more slowly now. Age had stiffened his fingers and weakened his back. Carrying water from the Nile took longer than it once had. Gathering fuel exhausted him quickly. But he still protected his fire each evening before sleep. The habit had become part of his life itself. Carefully, he stirred the weak coals with a broken pottery shard before covering them lightly with ash. Tomorrow's warmth now rested hidden beneath grey dust. The old man sat quietly for a while longer, watching the stars above the village. The sky looked endless tonight. Without bright lamps or city lights, the heavens over ancient Egypt appeared crowded with silver light. Entire rivers of stars stretched across the darkness, while the Nile below reflected them softly between patches of drifting reeds. Somewhere beyond the village, desert wind crossed empty sand beneath the moonlight. And inside homes beside the river, sleeping embers waited patiently for another dawn. Hours passed gently through the night. Then slowly, almost invisibly, morning approached again. The eastern horizon turned pale. Birds began calling from the reeds. Cool air drifted briefly through narrow streets before the heat returned. And once more, Egypt awakened beside the fire. Near one small courtyard, a grandmother rose before the rest of the household. Her knees hurt as she stood from the sleeping mat, and she paused for a moment beside the doorway, rubbing her aching hands together. Years beside ovens had worn her body slowly. Still, she moved toward the fire first. Always the fire first. Outside, the courtyard remained quiet except for distant grinding stones already beginning their steady morning rhythm somewhere farther down the street. The grandmother knelt beside the oven carefully. Her fingers brushed away ash. A faint red glow waited underneath. Still alive. She breathed softly against it. Tiny sparks appeared. Then smoke. Then flame. Soon the familiar smell of waking fire drifted into the cool dawn air. Her granddaughter emerged sleepily from inside the house carrying a clay bowl filled with flour. The child sat beside her grandmother silently while watching the fire strengthen. No words were needed. The girl already knew what came next. Water added slowly. Dough mixed carefully. Bread shaped by hand. The same rhythm repeated through generations beside the Nile. As sunlight spread gradually across the valley, more smoke rose above the village rooftops. Farmers carrying wooden tools walked toward green fields beyond the houses. Fishermen returned from the river with damp nets hanging over tired shoulders. And everywhere, cooking began again. Near the riverbank, a fisherman's wife roasted small fish over a low charcoal brazier while stirring thick grain porridge beside it. The smell drifted softly across the water. Her husband sat nearby repairing torn netting with slow, exhausted movements. His skin looked roughened by years beneath sun and river wind. Fishing demanded constant labor. Long nights rowing dark water. Heavy wet nets cutting into hands. Hours spent beneath insects and burning sunlight. Yet even after returning home tired, meals still needed preparing. Life beside the Nile rarely allowed complete rest. Nearby, two small boys gathered dry reeds along the river edge to bring home for fuel. Their feet pressed into cool mud while birds circled overhead searching for fish near the reeds. The boys carried the reeds carefully because dry fuel mattered greatly. Even a small bundle could help bake bread or heat lentils later in the day. Every household watched fuel supplies closely. Without enough fuel, meals became difficult. Bread remained undercooked. Water failed to boil. Fish spoiled before proper cooking. So children learned early to gather anything useful that might burn. Palm fibers. Dry straw. Broken branches. Animal dung hardened beneath the sun. Nothing could be ignored. By mid-morning, the village had become fully alive with movement and smoke. Near the market district, Bakers worked beside blazing ovens while laborers crowded the narrow street waiting for fresh bread. Flour dust floated through shafts of sunlight while sweat darkened the baker's linen clothing. One young baker reached too far into the oven and pulled his arm back quickly from the heat. The older baker beside him barely looked up. Burns belonged to the work. The young man wrapped cloth around the reddened skin and continued shaping dough. The ovens could not wait. Cities demanded bread every day without pause. Nearby, a stone worker purchased several loaves before continuing toward a building site beyond the city wall. Dust already clung to his legs from the road. He walked slowly beneath the strengthening sunlight. Warm bread rested beneath his arm. Simple food for another hard day. Inside ordinary homes, women continued cooking while the heat steadily grew heavier outside. Clay pots simmered gently over weak coals while children carried water jars from shaded storage corners. One mother prepared lentils flavored with garlic and herbs gathered from a small garden patch near the canal. Her baby slept beside her beneath a woven mat hung carefully to block flies. The mother stirred the pot slowly using a thin wooden branch blackened from years of cooking fires. Without proper tools, ordinary objects became essential through repeated use. Broken pottery lifted hot lids. Cloth protected hands briefly from burning clay. Sticks stirred stews and moved coals. Everything served many purposes. As noon approached, the sunlight became harsh across the Nile Valley once again. Heat reflected from walls and roads until the air itself seemed to shimmer. Cooking during these hours exhausted even experienced workers. Smoke clung low in still courtyards. Sweat rolled constantly down faces and backs. Clay ovens radiated fierce warmth long after the flames weakened. Some households avoided heavy cooking during midday whenever possible. Bread baked earlier in the morning might be eaten with onions, dates, or cheese instead. Still, many foods required constant attention. Stews simmered slowly. Beer mixtures fermented in shaded jars. Fish dried carefully in the sun. The labor never truly stopped. Near temple kitchens, servants moved steadily through thick heat carrying grain sacks and fuel bundles while priests passed quietly through cooler stone corridors nearby. Huge ovens glowed orange inside dark smoky rooms. The smell there felt heavy with ash and warm grain. One older cook sat beside a bubbling clay pot while rubbing tired eyes irritated by smoke. He had worked in temple kitchens since childhood. Nearly all his memories smelled of fire. Toward evening, relief slowly returned again. Long shadows stretched across the roads. Workers drifted home through dusty golden light. And once more, cooking fires brightened across Egypt. Families gathered quietly beside the evening warmth while the stars slowly returned above the Nile. The river flowed endlessly beyond the darkened fields. Children grew sleepy beside flickering oil lamps. And beneath the fading fires of another ancient night, hidden embers waited patiently beneath the ash. The Nile carried the moonlight gently through the darkness while the villages beside its banks rested beneath the warm night sky. The fires had quieted again. Only faint red glows remained beneath layers of ash inside clay ovens scattered across the valley. Smoke drifted lazily above rooftops before fading into the still night air. The smell of baked grain, burned reeds, and warm mud brick lingered softly between narrow streets where most people now slept. Ancient nights often felt heavy with silence after the endless labor of the day. No market shouting. No grinding stones turning. No workers calling across fields. Only distant sounds remained. A dog moving somewhere near the river. Palm leaves brushing together in the wind. The slow creak of tide boats shifting against wooden docks. And beneath everything, the quiet breathing of the Nile itself. Inside one small home near the canal fields, a young mother lay awake beside her sleeping children. The room remained dark except for a weak oil lamp flickering near the doorway. Her body felt sore from the day's work. She had carried water before sunrise, ground grain through the morning, cooked beside the fire during the hottest hours, then baked bread again before evening. Now her arms felt heavy with exhaustion. Still, before sleep fully took her, she listened for the fire. The oven rested outside in the courtyard against the mud wall. Even from inside the house she could almost sense the hidden warmth beneath the ash waiting there quietly. Tomorrow depended on those embers surviving the night. So much of Egyptian life depended on small careful habits like this. Protecting fire, saving grain, storing water, drying fuel before flood season. Life moved forward through patience more than speed. The woman finally closed her eyes while outside, the stars continued shining above the silent village. Farther downstream, inside a crowded city district near the temple walls, several workers still remained awake around large bakery ovens glowing bright orange in the darkness. The heat there never fully disappeared. One older baker rested briefly against a wall blackened by years of smoke while younger workers continued shaping dough nearby. Their hands moved steadily despite exhaustion. The bakery smelled thick with warm flour and ash. Stacks of reeds waited beside the ovens. Clay bowls covered in grain dust lined the floor. A boy no older than 12 carried water jars across the courtyard with slow careful steps. His shoulders looked thin beneath the weight. Children often worked early in Egyptian kitchens. Not because childhood ended quickly, but because survival required many hands. The boy had already learned how to judge oven heat by standing near the opening. He knew which fuel burned fastest and how smoke changed when the fire weakened. Years from now, his hands would likely carry scars like the older bakers beside him. But tonight, he simply continued carrying water beneath the firelight while the city slept around him. Near the river docks, sailors arriving late from upriver journeys prepared small meals beside portable braziers before resting on their boats. Smoke drifted low across the dark water while insects circled weak oil lamps hanging from wooden poles. One sailor warmed coarse bread over tiny coals while another cleaned dried fish beside him. Neither spoke very much. The long journey had exhausted them. Their hands smelled of wet rope and river mud. Tomorrow they would unload cargo beneath the sun. But for now, the warmth of food beside the quiet river felt enough. Hours passed gently beneath the stars. Then slowly, dawn approached once again. The eastern sky lightened from black to deep blue. Birds stirred among the reeds. Cool morning air drifted briefly through the village before the heat would return. And once more, hidden embers awakened beneath the ash. Near one farming village, an elderly woman stepped into her courtyard carrying dry palm fibers gathered earlier in the week. Her bare feet moved slowly across the cool packed earth while the rest of the household still slept inside. She knelt beside the oven carefully. Age had stiffened her knees badly now. For a moment she rested one hand against the warm clay before brushing away the ash covering last night's embers. A soft red glow waited underneath. Still alive. She smiled faintly. The woman fed tiny pieces of fiber into the ember while breathing gently against it. Thin smoke rose upward immediately, followed by the first weak flames of morning. Soon the familiar smell of waking fire filled the courtyard. It smelled comforting, safe, ancient. Nearby, a rooster called loudly from another rooftop while distant grinding stones began their steady scraping rhythm through the waking village. Stone against stone. Grain becoming flour. Morning beginning again. As the sky brightened, more homes joined the rhythm. Smoke lifted above mud brick rooftops. Water carriers walked toward the Nile balancing empty jars. Fishermen pushed boats away from the riverbank into pale silver water. And everywhere, people prepared food before the heat grew too strong. Inside the courtyard, the elderly woman's daughter emerged carrying a broad clay bowl filled with barley flour. Together they mixed dough quietly while two children still slept nearby beneath linen cloth. The daughter worked quickly now. Years of repetition had made the movements almost automatic. Water, flour, salt. Hands folding and pressing the dough softly. Nearby, the fire crackled gently inside the clay oven. Soon warm bread would feed the family before another day of labor. Near the center of the village, bakers already worked beside large public ovens where laborers gathered for fresh loaves before heading into the fields. The ovens glowed brightly in the dim morning light. Heat poured from the openings while bakers moved rapidly through smoke and flour dust. One man slapped flat rounds of dough against the hot oven wall using bare fingers hardened by years of burns and scars. Another removed finished bread using folded cloth wrapped tightly around both hands. Their bodies moved with practiced speed. Every moment mattered around the fire. Too slow, and the bread burned. Too fast, and the dough slipped into the coals. Experience guided every movement. Nearby, a young farmer waited patiently holding a woven basket against his chest. He had already walked from the canal fields before sunrise. Soon he would spend long hours beneath the sun repairing irrigation walls damaged during the last flood season. The bread tucked beneath his arm would help carry him through the morning. Simple food for difficult labor. As sunlight spread fully across the Nile Valley, the roads grew busier with movement. Donkeys loaded with grain sacks shuffled through narrow streets. Children carried bundles of reeds gathered for fuel. Merchants arranged onions, dates, fish, and oil beneath shaded market coverings. The smells of cooking drifted everywhere. Warm grain, smoke, roasted fish, garlic frying gently in oil. The atmosphere itself seemed built from food and fire. Inside ordinary homes, cooking continued steadily through the morning. Clay pots simmered over weak coals while women moved between ovens, water jars, and storage baskets with tired but practiced rhythm. One mother stirred lentils slowly while her youngest child played nearby with broken pottery pieces in the dust. The child occasionally looked toward the fire with wide curious eyes. Soon enough, those small hands would help carry fuel. Then shape dough. Then learn how close heat could come before pain arrived. This was how Egyptian cooking survived generation after generation. Not through written recipes, but through living memory beside the fire. By midday, the valley shimmered again beneath harsh sunlight. Heat settled heavily across fields, rooftops, canals, and courtyards while insects buzzed lazily above the riverbanks. Cooking became harder now. A woman leaned beside a low brazier wiping sweat from her face while trying to keep smoke away from a pot of simmering beans. The clay vessel bubbled gently. Fuel burned slowly beneath it. Nearby, her husband rested briefly in the shade after hauling stone all morning. Dust coated his skin and clothing while exhaustion darkened his eyes. She handed him warm bread without speaking much. Words often felt unnecessary after long labor. The quiet sharing of food carried enough meaning. Near temple kitchens, enormous ovens continued burning steadily while servants hurried through clouds of smoke carrying baskets of grain and bundles of reeds. The kitchens sounded alive with constant work. Fire crackling, clay lids tapping, grinding stones turning endlessly. An elderly cook tasted thick vegetable stew before adding herbs crushed carefully between his fingers. His face looked tired. His hands carried old burns. Yet he still trusted his senses more than any younger worker nearby. Years beside fire had taught him patience. Toward evening, the fierce sunlight finally softened again into gold. Workers returned home slowly through dusty roads. Children waited beside doorways. And once more, cooking fires brightened across the Nile Valley beneath the deepening sky. Families gathered quietly around evening meals while the river flowed endlessly beyond the darkened fields. The stars slowly returned overhead. Smoke drifted upward into the warm night. And beneath every fading oven, hidden embers waited patiently for another ancient dawn. The night beside the Nile grew quieter with every passing moment. The last cooking fires across the valley had almost disappeared now, leaving only soft hidden embers beneath pale layers of ash. Smoke no longer rose heavily into the air. It drifted gently instead, thin and slow beneath the silver moonlight. The villages rested. Mud brick walls still carried warmth from the long day beneath the sun. Clay ovens cooled little by little in silent courtyards where families now slept peacefully beside one another. A mother rested beside her children after hours spent grinding grain and baking bread. A fisherman slept near the riverbank with damp nets hanging quietly nearby. An old baker finally closed tired eyes after tending the ovens deep into the night. And somewhere beyond them all, the Nile continued flowing softly through the darkness exactly as it always had. The river moved past sleeping boats. Past reeds whispering in the warm breeze. Past temples and farms and quiet homes filled with the smell of smoke and baked grain. The stars above ancient Egypt looked endless now. Bright reflections shimmered gently across the water while insects hummed softly along the riverbanks. Palm leaves shifted against the night sky with slow patient movements. No one hurried anymore. The work had paused. The fires could rest. Even the ovens seemed peaceful now, their heat fading slowly into the stillness of the ancient night. Inside one final courtyard, an elderly woman stepped softly toward the oven before sleep. Her hands moved carefully through the cooling ash until she found the faint warmth still hidden underneath. A tiny ember remained alive there. Small. Quiet. Steady. She covered it gently for tomorrow. Then she turned away and disappeared into the darkness of her home while the ember continued glowing softly beneath the ash. And so the night settled fully over the Nile Valley. The river flowed on through the warm darkness. The stars watched silently above the sleeping world. And ancient Egypt, with its smoke-filled kitchens, weary workers, warm bread, glowing ovens, and quiet human lives, slowly faded into the calm and peaceful silence of the night.